Tonight, we're diving into the 12 long years that came after Paul Atreides won the untold reign of Muad'dib, from the moment he took the Golden Lion throne to the night he walked, blind, into the deep desert. Settle in now, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing to fear here, and nothing to solve. Only a slow, even voice tracing the strange and heavy years of a man who could see every future and was trapped by all of them. If these long, quiet stories are the ones that finally carry you under, a gentle subscribe keeps them coming, night after night, and that is the only small thing I will ask of you before we begin. Over the next 20 chapters, we will move, without haste, through the holy war fought in his name, the burden of his visions, the quiet grief of Chani, the slow gathering of a conspiracy, a resurrected friend, a stone that stole his sight, the birth of his children, and the sand that took him home at last. You do not need to hold on to any of it. Let it move through you like wind over a dune, slow and endless, and let it carry you, softly, down toward rest. Close your eyes now, and let the desert wind carry you far from this quiet room, across the stars, to a planet of endless sand, where a young man once became something greater, and something far heavier than a man. Picture the great hall of Arrakeen, its ceilings lost in shadow, its air still trembling faintly with the memory of battle. The fighting is over now. The city has gone quiet the way a body goes quiet after a long fever breaks, not healed, only exhausted, only waiting to understand what has been lost and what has been gained. Paul Atreides, who the desert people call Muad'dib, walks slowly across the stone floor toward the lion throne, and every step he takes seems to weigh more than the step before it, as though the future itself presses down upon his shoulders with invisible hands. Behind him, in memory only now, lie the ruins of House Harkonnen, the cruel family that once ruled this planet of Arrakis with whips and fear, and the shattered pride of Shaddam IV, the Padishah Emperor of 1,000 worlds, who came to Arrakis certain of his power and left it broken, kneeling, his throne no longer his own. The battle for the golden seat has been won. The spice, that precious substance found only in these deserts, the substance that lets the guild navigators fold space and starships leap between the stars, belongs now to the young duke turned emperor. But even as the banners of House Atreides rise slowly over the ancient city, even as the Fremen, the desert people who fought and bled beside him, chant his name in the streets like a prayer, Paul feels no lightness in his chest. He feels instead the terrible stillness of a man who can see, faintly, the long shadow that his victory will cast across the years to come. Let your breathing slow now, and imagine the throne room lit by soft lamps, the air thick with the scent of melange, that spice-laden fragrance that clings to everything on this planet, cinnamon and something deeper, something almost alive. Beside Paul stands Princess Irulan, daughter of the defeated emperor, tall and composed, her golden hair bound in the fashion of the imperial court, her eyes calm in the particular way of women trained since childhood by the Bene Gesserit, the ancient order of sisters who shape bloodlines and futures with patient, careful hands. It has been decided, in the manner that such things are always decided among the great houses, that Paul will marry her, not for love, never for love, but for the peace of the Imperium, so that the blood of Atreides and Carino might be seen to join, so that the 1,000 noble houses watching from their distant worlds might accept, however unwillingly, that the war has ended and a new order has begun. And so the marriage is made, a marriage of paper and treaty, a marriage that will never be a true joining of two hearts. For everyone in that vast hall and everyone watching from afar understands quietly that Irulan will be a wife in name only, a wife who will share a title, but never a bed, never a home, never the soft ordinary tenderness that binds two people together in the night. Paul takes her hand before the assembled nobles, and the ceremony unfolds with all its ancient solemnity, and somewhere far off, in the private chambers reserved for those closest to the new emperor, a woman named Chani waits, her heart heavy with an old and famous Fremen wisdom. The wisdom that says a concubine takes what she can, while a wife must only wait and endure. Picture Chani now, if you can, for she is the true heart of this story, though history will not always remember her as such. Slender and quick, her eyes the deep, endless blue of a Fremen who has spent a lifetime beneath the spice, she is the woman Paul truly loves, not the golden princess in her ceremonial robes, but this daughter of the desert, this fighter, this healer who walked beside him through hardship long before he ever dreamed of thrones. Chani will never sit beside him at the great state functions. She will never be called empress. And yet she is, in every way that matters to Paul's own weary heart, his true and only wife, and everyone in Arrakeen who has eyes to see understands this truth even as they bow before Irulan's title. Let the sound of distant Fremen drums fill your ears now, slow and rhythmic, like the beating of some vast and patient heart. Outside the palace walls, in the winding streets of Arrakeen, the desert warriors who followed Paul out of the deep sands, who saw in him their long-prophesied Lisan al-Gaib, their voice from the outer world, celebrate a victory that feels to them like the fulfillment of destiny itself. These are men and women hardened by a lifetime in the harshest desert known to humankind. Men and women who rode the great sandworms of Arrakis as weapons of war, who believe with the whole of their being that muad'dib is chosen, that his cause is holy, that his victory here in this single throne room is only the first small ripple of something far, far larger. And this is the part of the story that settles like a stone in the quiet of the night, the part that even Paul, with all his strange and terrible gift of seeing forward through time, cannot fully turn aside. For the price of this throne, the price of ending House Harkonnen's cruelty and Shaddam's arrogant rule, has not been small. Blood was spent without measure to win this seat. Loyalty was bought with promises of holy purpose. And now, in the hush after battle, as the banners settle and the drums slowly quiet, Paul stands upon the highest step of the Lion Throne and looks out over a hall full of kneeling nobles and worshipful desert fighters. And he feels, deep beneath his own victory, the cold understanding that a wave has been set in motion that he alone cannot now still. The Fremen legions, fanatic in their devotion, hungry for the holy war their prophecies have long promised them, are already looking outward, past Arrakis, past this one throne room, toward the countless worlds of the Imperium, still waiting, unconquered, beyond the stars. Rest now in this quiet moment before the storm, this single held breath between one victory and the vast unknown that follows it. Somewhere far off, gathered fleets are already stirring. Somewhere far off, the name of muad'dib is already spreading like fire along dry grass, carried by voices that will not be silenced, by soldiers who will not be satisfied with peace, by a religion still forming that will soon demand tribute in blood across 1,000 worlds. Paul Atreides sits upon his throne, an emperor now in truth, and yet, in the deepest chamber of his own heart, he already senses that the terrible cost of this day is only the very first payment of a debt whose true size he has not yet allowed himself to imagine. Up next, in Chapter 2, the jihad unleashed across the stars, we'll follow the Fremen legions as they carry Muad'dib's name far beyond Arrakis, sweeping outward across the galaxy in a holy war that even the Emperor himself cannot call back. Settle deeper now into the soft dark, and let your mind drift outward from that quiet throne room on Arrakis, out past the atmosphere, out into the vast black distances where the stars themselves seem to wait, patient and cold, for whatever comes next. In the months that follow the fall of Shaddam IV, something begins to move through the Imperium that no single decree, no single throne, no single man can fully contain. It begins quietly, the way great storms often begin, with a whisper carried from one mouth to another, a name repeated in market squares and starship corridors alike. Muad'dib. The people of 1,000 worlds have never seen him, have never stood in his presence, and yet already they speak his name the way one might speak the name of a god, half in wonder and half in fear. Let yourself imagine, slowly, how such a whisper travels. It does not move the way ordinary news moves, carried by official messengers and stamped with the seals of noble houses. It moves instead the way water moves through dry sand, seeping into every crack, every quiet corner, every heart already hungry for something to believe in after so many centuries of cold imperial order. Traders passing through distant spaceports repeat what they have heard from other traders. Pilgrims begin gathering even before any priesthood has told them where to gather, drawn by rumor alone toward the golden desert world, where a new power has arisen. In taverns on 100 different planets, in languages that share almost nothing in common, the same two syllables begin to surface, spoken sometimes in reverence and sometimes in uneasy wonder. For something in the shape of this name feels larger than any single man could ever be. Imagine now the great troop transports rising from the landing fields of Arrakis, their hulls dark and enormous against the pale desert sky, carrying within them the Fremen warriors who once knew only sand and thirst, and the long, patient rhythms of desert life. These are the same men and women who learned to read the wind, who rode the giant worms called Shai-Hulud as both mount and weapon, who survived in a world so harsh that only the strongest and most devoted could endure it. Now they carry that same fierce devotion outward, off the only planet most of them have ever known, toward worlds of green forests and blue oceans and crowded, unsuspecting cities, worlds that have never faced anything like the storm now arriving at their shores. Picture the quiet strangeness of that departure if you can, the Fremen boarding these vast ships for the very first time. Men and women who had spent their whole lives measuring distance in footsteps across dunes, now measuring it instead in the light of distant stars glimpsed through a viewport. Some among them had never before seen open water, had never imagined forests thick enough to lose oneself within, had never known a sky that did not burn pale and merciless overhead. And yet they carry with them, wherever they go, the same unshaken certainty that sustained them through years of hardship in the desert, a certainty now fastened entirely to the name of the man who led them out of that hardship and onto the golden throne. Picture one such world, far from Arrakis, its people going about their ordinary lives, tending fields, raising children, believing themselves safe behind the old order of Landsraad law and imperial peace. And then imagine the first ships descending, and the first Fremen legions moving through their streets, not merely as conquerors seeking land or wealth, but as believers carrying a holy purpose, certain in their hearts that they act in service of the Lisan al-Gaib, the Messiah risen from among them. This is the terrible engine of the jihad, the holy war. And it does not move like an ordinary army. It moves like a religion given legs and swords. And it does not stop simply because a battle is won, for in the eyes of those who carry it, no battle is ever truly finished until every corner of the galaxy has bowed to Muad'dib's name. Let yourself notice, gently, how different this is from the wars of old, the disputes between noble houses fought over spice contracts and border worlds, wars with beginnings and endings, treaties and truces, wars that could be negotiated and settled by careful diplomats around a table. This war carries no such shape. It moves according to a different kind of hunger entirely, one that cannot be satisfied by the surrender of a single world or the signing of a single treaty. For what it seeks is not territory but conviction, not tribute but belief. And belief, once it has taken hold of an army numbering in the millions, does not release its grip easily. Let yourself imagine, gently, the reports that begin arriving back on Arrakis, carried by guild ships and careful messengers, describing world after world falling beneath the advancing wave. Some surrender quickly, their governors kneeling before Fremen commanders in hopes of mercy. Others resist, clinging to old loyalties, old gods, old ways of life, and these resistances are broken slowly, patiently, the way water eventually wears down even the hardest stone. And all the while, back in the quiet chambers of the palace at Arrakeen, Paul Atreides receives these reports one after another, and each one lands upon him like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through a heart that never wanted any of this to happen in quite this way. Picture the particular texture of those reports, arriving in careful, formal language that somehow makes the enormity of what they describe seem almost ordinary, almost administrative. Names of worlds Paul has never visited, and likely never will. Numbers of casualties rendered in the flat, distant tone of official record-keeping. Descriptions of surrenders and resistances, of governors who yielded and governors who did not, each account folded neatly into the next, as though the fate of entire civilizations could be summarized in a few careful sentences and set aside for the following day's business. And yet, Paul reads every one of them closely, unable to look away, unable to grant himself the mercy of not knowing exactly what is being done in his name. For here is the strange and heavy truth that settles over Paul in these early days of his reign, a truth that visits him most often in the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace is silent and only his own thoughts keep him company. He possesses a gift, inherited through long bloodlines, shaped carefully by the Bene Gesserit and awakened fully by the spice of Arrakis, a gift that lets him glimpse, however dimly, the branching paths of possible futures stretching out before him like countless roads through a dark forest. And in the vast tangle of those futures, he had seen, long before ever setting foot upon the golden throne, a terrible corridor of war and death, waiting at the end of every path that led to victory. He had hoped, in the quiet way that a man hopes against what he already suspects to be true, that he might somehow steer around that corridor, that his own will and cunning might yet find some narrower, gentler road. Let this settle over you slowly. The particular loneliness of carrying such a gift, of having walked already, in the private country of his own visions, through countless versions of this very moment before it ever arrived in the waking world. He had studied those branching roads the way a man studies a map before a long and dangerous journey, searching every fork and turning for some path that might lead somewhere gentler than this. And though he found other roads, other futures, none of them, in the end, seemed to lead anywhere but towards some greater ruin still. It is a strange kind of grief, to mourn a future before it has even fully arrived, to feel its weight pressing down upon you in the present, simply because you have already glimpsed its shape somewhere in the depths of your own mind. But threads once pulled do not always return to the weaver's hand, and here now, only a short time into his reign, Paul watches with a growing and private horror as the jihad he feared moves forward with a will of its own, gathering speed and hunger the way a great boulder gathers speed once it begins rolling down a long slope. He is emperor. He commands armies beyond counting. He sits upon the most powerful throne in known space. And yet, in this one particular matter, in this holy war carried in his name across 1,000 worlds, he finds himself, again and again, unable to simply reach out his hand and make it stop. The Fremen do not fight for conquest alone, and they would not easily be turned back even by their own prophet, for the war has become something larger than any single command, a fire that burns now according to its own hungry logic. Rest here a moment, in this strange and troubling stillness, and picture Paul standing alone at a high window of the palace, looking out over the darkened dunes of Arrakis, listening to the distant wind moving grain by grain across the endless sand. He thinks of the worlds he has never seen, the cities burning gently in the reports brought to him each day, the countless lives being reshaped, ended, or remade entirely in the name of a man who once wished only to protect his own family, his own people, from destruction. He thinks of the visions that first showed him this path, long ago, in the deep desert among the Fremen, and how even then he had recognized this jihad as one of the terrible costs of the future he was walking toward, a cost he had accepted only because every other path he could see led to something worse. Let your breathing stay slow as you sit with him in that memory. The memory of a younger man moving among the Fremen tents, learning their ways, earning their trust, long before any throne or crown had entered into the shape of his life. Even then, in those early days of learning to survive the desert, he had felt the first cold edges of this vision brushing against him in dreams, a premonition of fire spreading outward across the stars, carried by the very people whose friendship and loyalty he was only beginning to earn. He had said nothing of it then, not even to those closest to him, hoping perhaps that silence might somehow keep the vision from ever fully taking shape, the way a person might hold very still in the dark, hoping the thing they fear has not yet noticed them. And so the war spreads onward, planet after planet, season after season, carried by soldiers who believe with their whole hearts that they serve something sacred, while far behind them, upon his golden throne, their emperor watches the flames rise across the galaxy and understands, more clearly with each passing day, that he has become the reluctant author of a story whose ending even he cannot yet fully see. Up next, in Chapter 3, 60 billion dead in his name, we'll learn the true and staggering cost of this holy war and watch Paul confront, in the quiet privacy of his own conscience, the terrible weight of what has been done beneath his banner. Let the weight of your own body settle now into whatever soft surface holds you, arms loose, breath slow. While we turn together toward one of the heaviest chapters in this long and quiet story, a chapter that must be told gently, the way one might speak of old grief that has finally been laid to rest. Years have passed now since the fall of Shaddam IV, years measured not in months but in seasons of war stretching across the known galaxy, and in this quiet hour, we come to the reckoning, the terrible sum that history will one day set down in careful, sorrowful numbers. Let yourself imagine, first, the sheer scale of time this reckoning represents. Not a single terrible night, nor a single terrible battle, but season folding into season, year folding into year. An unbroken current of distant war carried across a galaxy so vast that news of one world's fall might take months simply to reach the ears of the emperor who caused it. Somewhere in that long unfolding, ordinary life continued on 1,000 worlds untouched by the fighting. Children were born, harvests were gathered, and yet always, beneath the surface of that ordinary life, the war moved onward, patient and unrelenting, gathering its terrible total one world at a time. Picture a great chamber deep within the palace at Arrakeen, where scribes and advisors labor quietly over records brought from 1,000 worlds, tallies of the dead, counts of the fallen, reports gathered from guild ships that carry news across the vast distances between stars. And imagine, if you can bear its size, the number that finally emerges from all that labor, a number so vast it seems to lose its shape as a true accounting of human lives, and instead becomes something almost abstract, something the mind struggles to hold. 61 billion souls, extinguished across the years of this holy war, carried out planet by planet in the name of muad'dib. 90 worlds left sterilized, their surfaces scoured of the life that once filled them, their cities silent now beneath skies that no longer shelter anyone at all. Entire religions, entire ways of believing and living that had endured for centuries, erased so completely that within a generation few will remember they ever existed. Imagine the scribes themselves in that quiet chamber, bent over their careful ledgers by soft lamplight, adding figure to figure long into the night. Men and women trained since childhood in the patient arts of record-keeping, and yet even they, it is said, grow quiet and still when the final sum is set down, unable for a long moment to speak, as though the number itself demands a kind of silence that no words could properly follow. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from counting sorrow at such a scale, an exhaustion that settles into the hands and the eyes long before it reaches the heart, and only afterward, in the stillness that follows, does the true weight of what has been recorded finally arrive. Let this settle slowly, the way sand settles after a storm, layer upon quiet layer, for it is not meant to frighten you, but only to be witnessed, gently as one witnesses a great and sorrowful truth. Paul Atreides, now firmly established as Emperor of 1,000 worlds, receives these final tallies alone, in the privacy of his own chambers, and something in him, something that has been holding steady since the day he first ascended the golden throne, seems finally to bend beneath the true and terrible shape of what his name has come to mean. He is a man who once wished only to save his family, his people, his beloved desert planet from destruction, and now he finds himself the emperor in whose honor 61 billion lives have been spent like water poured into desert sand. Notice, if you will, the particular stillness of that private chamber as he reads, the lamp burning low, the report resting heavy in his hands though it weighs. In truth, no more than any other parchment. He reads the number once, and then, as though his mind cannot quite accept it on the first pass, he reads it again, letting the digits arrange themselves slowly into something his heart can begin, however imperfectly, to comprehend. There is no anger in this reading, no shock exactly, for he has long known some version of this cost was coming. There is only the slow, settling arrival of grief too large to hold all at once. Grief that must instead be carried in pieces, a little at a time, the way one carries water across a great distance in the desert, careful not to spill what little comfort remains. Imagine him standing at that same high window where he so often stands in the quiet hours, looking out over the darkened dunes, and feel, if you can, the particular sorrow of a man who saw this outcome coming long before it arrived, who walked toward it anyway because every vision available to him showed something worse waiting down every other path. This is the strange and lonely burden of Paul's gift, the burden of prescience, the ability to glimpse the branching futures stretching ahead of him like countless roads through darkness. He had seen, long before the jihad ever began, a version of this exact horror waiting at the end of the road that led to his own victory. And he had chosen that road anyway, believing, in the desperate calculus of a man protecting everything he loved, that all the other roads led somewhere even more terrible, a place his visions called only the terrible purpose, a future so vast and destructive that this jihad, sorrowful as it was, remained the lesser of unbearable choices. Let yourself sit with the strange shape of that word, terrible purpose, a phrase that had visited him in dreams long before he understood what it truly meant, back when he was still young enough to believe that visions were simply strange and passing things, not yet the heavy architecture of a life he could not fully escape. He remembers, even now, how that phrase felt the first time it surfaced in his sleeping mind, cold and enormous, like a shadow glimpsed at the edge of a dune, just before the light fades entirely. He had not understood it then. He is not certain he fully understands it even now, only that every path he ever traced away from it led somewhere he trusted even less. And yet knowing this, having accepted this terrible bargain with his own eyes open, does not make the weight any lighter to carry now that the numbers are finally counted and set down before him. Picture the private grief that moves through him in these quiet hours, a grief he shows almost no one, for an emperor cannot easily weep before his court, cannot easily confess to his advisors and his priests that the war fought in his sacred name fills him with a horror he can barely contain. He thinks of the worlds now silent, the families that will never gather again, the children who might have grown old on planets that no longer hold anyone at all. And he understands, with the clear and merciless vision granted to him by the spice, that history will remember him now not only as a liberator, but as something far darker, a figure whose name will be spoken with dread on 100 worlds for 1,000 years to come. Let yourself imagine, softly, what it might mean to know your own future reputation with such terrible clarity, to understand already, while still young, still capable of tenderness, still deeply in love, that history has already begun writing you into its darkest chapters. Most people move through their lives never knowing how they will be remembered, and there is a kind of mercy in that not knowing, a freedom to hope quietly that one's name might be spoken kindly. Paul carries no such freedom. He has seen enough of the branching futures to know, with unwelcome certainty, that whatever comfort future generations might find in calling him liberator, an equal number will speak his name only in fear, and both truths, he understands, are simply and permanently his to carry. Let your breathing stay slow, and even as we sit with this sorrow a moment longer, not to dwell in darkness, but simply to understand the true shape of the burden that this young emperor carries quietly beneath his golden robes. He did not want this. He fought, in the secret councils of his own mind, against every vision that showed this outcome, searching endlessly for some narrower path that might spare these worlds, these people, these countless lives now gone. But the currents of history, once set moving by the deep and ancient hungers of the Fremen people, by centuries of careful manipulation from the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, by the desperate momentum of prophecy fulfilling itself, proved too vast and too strong even for a man who could glimpse the future itself. Picture, gently, how many nights he must have spent in those early years searching for that narrower path, turning over possibility after possibility in the quiet dark of his own mind, testing each one against the visions available to him, only to find, again and again, some new horror waiting just past the edge of what he could clearly see. There is a particular kind of exhaustion in searching so long for a mercy that never quite arrives, an exhaustion that settles into a person slowly, the way cold settles into stone through a long desert night, and by the time the jihad had truly begun, Paul had already spent himself searching for an alternative that, in the end, simply did not exist. And so Paul Atreides sits alone this night, as he has sat alone so many nights before, an emperor who rules from the most powerful throne in the galaxy, and yet feels, in the depths of his own conscience, more like a man drowning slowly beneath the weight of choices he cannot undo. He thinks of Chani, sleeping now in the chambers not far from his own, the one steady comfort in all this vast and terrible responsibility. He thinks of the desert beyond the palace walls, endless and patient, indifferent to empires and prophecies alike. And somewhere in that quiet thinking, he finds just enough strength to rise each morning and continue governing an empire built upon a foundation of 61 billion sorrows, carrying forward because there is, in truth, nowhere else left for him to go. Up next in Chapter 4, Muad'dib, Emperor and God, we'll step inside the strange machinery of the empire Paul now rules, where priests call him divine, even as old and powerful orders quietly begin to plot against the throne he never fully wanted. Let yourself sink a little further now into the stillness of this hour, and imagine, softly, the sound of distant chanting drifting through the corridors of a great temple built upon the sands of Arrakis, a temple raised in honor of a man who never asked to be worshipped, and yet who now sits at the very center of a religion spreading across 1,000 worlds. This is the strange shape the empire has taken in the years since Paul Atreides claimed the Golden Throne. He rules now not merely as emperor, with armies and treaties and the ordinary machinery of governance, but as something the people of the Imperium have chosen to call divine, a living God walking among them. And the weight of that particular title rests upon him in ways that even his own vast gift of foresight did not fully prepare him to carry. Let yourself imagine the temple itself rising from the pale sand in great terraces of stone, its corridors cool and shadowed even beneath the fierce desert sun outside, its walls carved with the likeness of a face that belongs to a man still living, still breathing, still uncertain in his own private heart whether he deserves any of what is spoken of him within these walls. Pilgrims arrive here from worlds Paul himself has never visited, traveling for months across the vast distances of space simply to stand for a moment within sight of these carved images, to offer some small token of devotion, to feel, if only briefly, that they have drawn nearer to the God whose name has reshaped their understanding of the universe itself. Picture the priesthood that has grown up around his name, an order the people call the Chizarat, robed figures who travel from world to world carrying the teachings of muad'dib, establishing shrines, training missionaries, gathering tribute and devotion in equal measure. These are not soldiers, though soldiers march beside the faith they preach, and they are not simple clergy either, For the religion of muad'dib has become, in the years since the jihad first swept outward from Arrakis, something closer to a second government entirely, its reach extending into every corner of daily life across the Imperium. Its priests holding influence that rivals even the great noble houses of the Landsraad. Paul watches this machinery grow around him with a complicated heart, for he understands, better than anyone, how much of this worship was never truly about him at all, but about the deep and ancient human hunger for something larger than themselves to believe in. Imagine, gently, how such an order takes root on a newly conquered world. How the Gesserit missionaries arrive quietly in the wake of the soldiers, offering comfort where there was once only fear, offering meaning where there was once only loss, and how easily grieving people, their old temples fallen, their old gods seemingly powerless before the storm that swept them aside, might turn instead toward this new and undeniable power that has proven itself, at least to be real. Paul understands this hunger intimately, having felt something like it himself in the deep desert long ago, and it troubles him quietly to see it turned now toward his own name, a name he never intended to carry such enormous, sacred weight. Let your breathing settle further as we turn now to the quieter corners of the palace, where advisors and courtiers move carefully through halls thick with unspoken tension, for not everyone within the Imperium has welcomed this new order gladly. Imagine the representatives of the Spacing Guild, that strange and ancient organization whose navigators, transformed by long exposure to the spice, alone possess the terrible gift of folding space itself, allowing starships to leap between the stars in the blink of an eye. Once the guild held enormous power over the flow of trade and travel across the entire Imperium, for nothing moved between worlds without their consent. Now, with Paul controlling the deserts of Arrakis, and therefore the only true source of the spice that the guild itself depends upon to navigate, their old power has grown brittle, and their resentment toward the throne, though carefully hidden behind polite diplomatic courtesies, runs deep and cold. Picture the guild representatives themselves, arriving at court in their heavy formal robes, their voices measured and careful, their faces schooled into perfect diplomatic calm, even as, beneath that calm, an old and proud order reckons quietly with its own diminishment. They speak to Paul always with the correct words, the correct courtesies, and yet something in the careful stiffness of their bearing betrays what politeness will not allow them to say aloud, that they resent, deeply and completely, having become dependent upon the goodwill of a single throne for the very substance that sustains their entire way of life. Paul receives them with equal courtesy, understanding perfectly well the currents moving beneath their careful words, for prescience, whatever else it costs him, at least spares him the trouble of being easily deceived. Picture also the Bene Gesserit, that ancient sisterhood of women who have spent countless generations quietly arranging marriages and bloodlines across 1,000 noble houses, working always toward a single hidden purpose. The careful breeding of a superior being they called the Kwisatz Haderach, a man who might see forward and backward through time with perfect clarity. Paul himself, born of their careful plans yet arriving one generation earlier than they intended, escaped their full control, and worse, from their perspective, he seized for himself the very power they had spent centuries preparing to command. The sisterhood watches him now, from the shadows of court and council alike, patient in the particular way that only women who measure time in centuries can be patient, waiting, calculating, searching quietly for whatever small crack might one day let them undo what this unexpected emperor has done to their long and careful design. Imagine the particular quality of patience such women carry, patience unlike anything found in ordinary life. Patience measured not in years, but in generations, in bloodlines carried carefully forward from grandmother to granddaughter across centuries of careful, unseen labor. To such women, Paul is not simply an emperor to be managed or resented in the way one might resent a rival house. He is instead a variable that slipped free of an equation they had spent an almost unimaginable span of time solving, and though they cannot undo what has already happened, they have not for a moment stopped searching, quietly, endlessly, for whatever small adjustment might yet bring their long design back into alignment. Let this quiet tension settle over you now like a heavy blanket, warm but not without its weight, as you imagine the daily life of an empire held together by equal parts devotion and dread. In the temples, the faithful pray to muad'dib as though he were a god descended among them, offering tribute, seeking blessing, believing with their whole hearts in his divine and prophetic nature. And in the shadowed councils of the guild and the sisterhood, older powers who once ruled the imperium from behind its thrones now find themselves diminished, watching, waiting, nursing a resentment that grows quieter but no less dangerous with every passing year. Paul himself moves between these two realities each day, an emperor beloved as a god by billions and yet quietly despised by the very institutions that once shaped the galaxy according to their own patient designs. Let yourself imagine the strange, almost dreamlike quality of Paul's ordinary day, moving in the span of a single morning from a great public audience where pilgrims weep simply at the sight of him, certain they stand before a living God, into a private council chamber where the same careful diplomats who bowed before him only hours earlier now measure their every word, calculating precisely how much truth they can afford to withhold. Few men in the long history of the Imperium have ever occupied so strange a position, worshipped without reservation by the many, and distrusted without exception by the few who understand best what he truly is, a man, gifted and burdened, doing his uncertain best beneath the crushing weight of a title he never fully chose for himself. Imagine Paul in the private hours of evening, seated alone with Chani in the softly lit chambers reserved only for those he trusts completely, and picture the tiredness that settles into his shoulders here, away from the great halls and the chanting priests. He has built, or perhaps more truly, he has allowed to be built around him, an empire unlike any that has come before, a theocracy vast and strange, held together by faith as much as by force, and he understands, with the clear and merciless vision that the spice has given him, that such structures rarely remain stable forever. Somewhere in the folds of this empire, old grievances are gathering quietly, old powers displaced and humiliated are beginning, patiently, to whisper together in rooms far from his own hearing, and though he cannot yet see the precise shape of what is coming, he feels it approaching the way one feels a change in weather long before the first clouds appear on the horizon. Let yourself notice, in this quiet evening scene, how different Paul seems here from the distant, godlike figure the pilgrims imagine when they whisper his name in the temple corridors. Here, in this small, softly lit room, he is only a tired young man, his robes set aside, his voice low, speaking perhaps of ordinary things, the day's small frustrations, a memory of the desert before any of this began. And Chani listens the way she has always listened, without awe, without worship, seeing him simply as the man she loves rather than the god 1,000 worlds now kneel before. It is perhaps the only place left to him in the entire Imperium where he is permitted to simply be a man, and he treasures these quiet hours more than any of the vast power that surrounds him during the day. Rest now in this quiet uncertainty, gentle and unhurried, for there is nothing here that demands urgency, only the slow, patient turning of a great and complicated wheel. Paul Atreides sits at the very center of an empire built from prophecy and blood alike, worshipped by billions, resented by a handful of ancient and powerful orders who have not forgotten what he has taken from them. And somewhere in the quiet dark beyond the palace walls, the first threads of a conspiracy are already beginning, slowly and carefully, to weave themselves together. Up next in Chapter 5, The Weight of Every Possible Future, we'll step gently inside the private burden of Paul's prescience itself and understand what it truly costs a man to carry the endless, branching weight of every future he can, almost, but never quite, fully see. There is a kind of darkness that has nothing to do with the absence of light, and it lived now behind the eyes of the man the galaxy called Muad'dib. He sat in the quiet hours when the palace on Arrakis grew still, and the wind outside seemed to hold its breath against the stone, and he looked at nothing, because there was no single nothing left for him to look at. There were only futures, layered one upon another like grains of sand pressed into strata, each one true, each one waiting, each one a door he had already, in some sense, walked through, and would walk through again. Paul Atreides, who had become something larger and stranger than a man, carried within him the terrible gift of prescience, and on this night, as on every night, he understood again how a gift of such size could also be a kind of prison with no walls. Because a prison with walls can at least be measured, and this one could not. He had seen, long ago, the shape of the thing that would carry his name across the stars, like fire carried across dry grass, and he had let it happen. Or perhaps he had only failed to stop it, which in the strange arithmetic of his visions amounted to the same helpless verb. Now he lived inside the aftermath of that seeing. An emperor who ruled from a throne built of prophecy, and the loneliest part of it, the part he could share with no one, not even Chani, not even in the dark hours when her breathing beside him was the only true and steady thing in his world, was this: that to see the future is not to be free of it. It is to be woven into it more tightly than any ordinary man is woven into his single unfolding day. An ordinary man wakes not knowing what will happen, and in that not knowing there is a kind of mercy, a soft blindness that lets him act as though his choices matter absolutely, as though the day is unwritten. Paul woke each morning already remembering, in a manner more vivid than memory, the branching paths that lay ahead of him, dozens of them, hundreds of them, and worse than the seeing was the knowledge that some paths, however narrow, however cruel, kept reappearing no matter which way he leaned, the way a single dark thread will keep surfacing in a tapestry, no matter how the weaver tries to bury it beneath brighter colors. He thought sometimes, in the long, unhurried quiet that visions leave behind, of the desert itself, of how a man walking across the open sand believes he chooses his own path, left or right around a dune, faster or slower as the heat rises, and yet the great dunes themselves have already decided the general shape of his journey, have funneled him gently, irresistibly, toward the low places between them, so that his choices are real and also small. Real, and also nested inside a shape vastly larger than himself. This was what it meant to hold the future in his mind, the way Paul held it, a landscape so vast that his own decisions became small motions within it, true and yet dwarfed. He had walked into the jihad, the great and terrible movement of his followers, across 100 worlds, in part because he had seen that walking away from it led to something worse, some darker convulsion of the human future that he could not fully name even to himself. And so he had chosen the lesser flood, the smaller fire, and had called it, in the silence of his own heart, a golden path, only because every other path he could see was black. It is a hard thing to carry the knowledge that goodness, real goodness, is not always available to a man who can see too far, and Paul, walking the corridors of his palace at hours when even the Fremen guards had gone quiet, understood that his own moral choices had narrowed the further his sight extended. The way a corridor narrows, the deeper one walks into a mountain, until at the very end there is barely room to turn at all. He had wanted, once, as a young man on Caladan before any of this had begun, simply to be a duke's son, to learn the sword and the old manners, and grow into a life that unfolded in the ordinary way, one day revealing itself only as it arrived. That boy still lived somewhere inside him, buried under the visions the way a seed is buried under a great weight of Dune, and on nights like this one, Paul let himself remember that boy with a tenderness that had almost nothing to do with the emperor he had become. Because the boy had not yet learned that to see everything is very close to being free of nothing. He rose, sometimes, and walked to the window that looked out over the endless dark of the desert, out toward the place where Arrakis kept its secrets folded beneath the sand, and he let the visions move through him the way sediment moves through water, settling, resettling, forming and unforming shapes that were never quite finished. He saw Chani in 100 futures, some tender, some sorrowful, and he saw children who did not yet exist casting long shadows backward into his present, shadows that troubled the very rooms he stood in. He saw Irulan in her chambers writing her histories, shaping the story of his reign into words that would outlive him regardless of what actually happened. And he saw, faintly, the outlines of men in distant places, men whose names he did not yet fully know, bending their heads together over plans that concerned him, plans still gathering shape the way weather gathers over open water before anyone below has learned to look up. None of it was fixed. All of it was, in some measure, true. This was the strange arithmetic of his gift, that many futures could be equally real until the moment one of them closed its hand around the others and became the only one left standing. He did not speak of this to the ministers who came each day with their maps and their tallies of dead and their petitions from 100 conquered systems, because there were no words in any language, not even the old sacred tongues the Fremen still murmured in their sleep, that could carry the particular weight of knowing too much. He had tried, once or twice, to explain it to Chani in the hushed and unguarded hour before sleep, and she had listened with the fierce attentiveness of a woman who loved him without reservation, and even she, who understood the desert and its ways better than anyone alive, could only hold his hand and let the silence do what words could not. It was, Paul thought, the loneliest kind of love there was, to be understood and still be alone, to be held by the one person in the universe who trusted him utterly, and still to carry, behind his own eyes, an entire unshareable geography of possible worlds. And yet there was one comfort, small and steady as a lamp in a dark tent, that stayed with him through these long nights, and it was Chani herself, her warmth beside him in the dark, her voice low and certain when she spoke of ordinary things, of water rings and sandworms, and the small daily business of the Fremen who had once been her only family. In her presence the endless branching futures grew quieter, not gone, never gone, but quieter, the way wind grows quieter inside a sheltered hollow of rock. And it was there, in that small quiet, that another longing had begun to stir in her, a longing Paul could already see gathering shape among his visions, a longing for a child of their own to carry his name and her blood forward into whatever future waited beyond the sand. Up next, in Chapter 6, Chani and the Longing for an Heir, we will follow Chani's deepening wish for a child and the quiet fear that moved through Paul each time he looked ahead and saw what such a child might mean for all of them. In the quiet hours of the palace, when the great business of empire had been folded away for the night like a cloak set aside, Chani would sometimes lie awake beside Paul and let her hand rest lightly over her own body, feeling for a fullness that was not yet there, wishing for it with a patience that had grown, over the years, into something closer to ache than hope. She was Fremen still, in every part of her that mattered, no matter how many silks the court dressed her in, or how many titles the outside world withheld from her. And among her people a woman's worth had long been bound up with the children she gave to the tribe, with the small lives that would grow to walk the sand and read its moods the way their mothers and grandmothers had read it before them. Chani wanted a child the way the desert wants water, which is to say, with a wanting so deep it had stopped feeling like wanting at all and had become instead simply a part of who she was, waking and sleeping. She had given Paul a son once, years before, in the earliest and harshest days of their life together, a small boy named Leto, who had lived only briefly before the war took him, and that loss had settled into her like sand into the folds of a stillsuit, present in every movement even when it could not be seen. She did not speak of little Leto often, because grief among the Fremen was carried quietly, folded inward rather than displayed. But she carried him always, and in her longing now for another child there was not only desire, but a kind of restitution, a wish to set something living and whole against the emptiness that loss had left behind. She watched the women of the court, the ladies of Irulan's circle who came and went through the palace with their soft hands and their careful words, and she felt, sometimes, a flicker of something that was not quite envy and not quite grief, but held pieces of both, because none of those women carried the weight she carried, and none of them wanted, as she wanted, to give the man beside her a child who might steady him against the storm of his own visions. Paul loved her without reservation, and this was not in question, not to her and not to anyone in the palace who watched them together, the emperor and his Fremen concubine, who was in every way but law his true wife. But Paul also feared, and his fear moved through their private hours together like a current beneath calm water, invisible until one tried to swim against it. He had looked ahead, as he was always looking ahead, and in the branching futures he saw a child of Chani's body cast a long shadow across the years to come, a shadow whose exact shape he could not always read, but whose weight he felt pressing against the present moment, the way a coming storm presses against the air long before the first cloud appears on the horizon. He did not know, in any given month, whether a child conceived now would grow to be a blessing to the world or a hinge on which some darker door might swing open. And this uncertainty, more than any personal reluctance, made him hold back from the fullness of hope that Chani wanted so badly to share with him. He never told her, in plain words, that he feared what a child might mean, because to tell her would have been to burden her with a portion of the loneliness he already carried alone, and he loved her too much to hand her that particular weight. Instead, he was gentle, endlessly gentle, in the way he deflected her hopeful questions, in the way he changed the subject when she spoke of the small rooms near their own chambers that might one day be given over to a nursery, in the way he held her a little longer after these conversations, as though the holding could stand in for the words he could not bring himself to say. Chani, who was no fool and had never been one, sensed this reluctance in him even without understanding its source, and she wondered, in her private hours, whether the fault lay somewhere in her own body, whether the desert had taken something from her in the hard years of the war that it had not given back. What she did not know, what no one in the palace save a very few carefully chosen conspirators knew, was that her body was not entirely her own to read, and that her monthly courses, which came and went in a pattern she had begun to find strange without knowing quite why, were being quietly, invisibly guided by hands other than her own. Irulan, the princess who wore the title of Empress and none of its comforts, moved through the kitchens and the still rooms of the palace with the easy authority of a woman born to command households. And among her many small and careful arrangements was one that she guarded more closely than any other: a certain preparation, drawn from old Bene Gesserit knowledge of herbs and physic, that found its way, drop by drop, meal by meal, into the food and drink that reached Chani's table. It was not poison, not in the crude sense that would have raised alarm among the tasters and the guards who watched over every dish that reached the emperor's household, but something subtler, a quiet interference with the body's own rhythms, designed to keep a child from taking root in Chani's womb without Chani ever suspecting that any hand but nature's own was at work. Irulan told herself, in the private counsel of her own conscience, that she acted from necessity rather than cruelty, that a child born to Paul and his beloved Fremen woman would settle forever the question of succession in a way that would strip from Irulan the last shred of purpose she still held in this palace where she was wife in name only, honored in histories yet to be written and ignored in every room where love actually lived. She told herself, too, that the Bene Gesserit who had trained her and who watched her now from a great and careful distance had their own reasons, older and larger than her own small grief, for wanting no heir to rise from Chani's body, reasons bound up with bloodlines and breeding programs that stretched back centuries before Paul Atreides had ever been born, and Irulan, caught between her own wounded pride and the long patient will of the sisterhood that had shaped her since childhood, found it easier to obey than to ask herself too closely what obedience was costing the woman who slept each night in the bed that should, by every treaty and title, have belonged to Irulan herself. And so the months passed, and Chani's hope rose and fell like the tide of some sea that Arrakis had never known, and Paul watched her disappointment with a tenderness that could not quite mask his private and unspoken relief, not understanding that the very thing he feared to cause was already, by another's hand, being quietly prevented. While somewhere in the palace's cooler halls, Irulan bent over her histories by lamplight and wrote of an emperor's greatness in words that gave no hint of the small, patient cruelty she practiced each day in his own house. Up next in Chapter 7, Irulan, the wife in name only, we will follow Irulan more closely still, and come to understand the long loneliness of a princess who ruled nothing but her own pen, and how that loneliness had begun to bend toward conspiracy. Princess Irulan Corrino, daughter of the fallen Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, moved through the palace on Arrakis with the perfect posture of a woman who had been raised since infancy to occupy a throne, and yet she occupied nothing at all. Not truly. Not in the way that mattered to a heart that had once imagined itself destined for greatness of its own. She had come to Paul Atreides not through love, and not even through simple ambition, but through the cold arithmetic of politics, a marriage arranged in the aftermath of her father's defeat to bind the old imperial house to the new one, to give Paul's rule the appearance of continuity even as it broke, in truth, from everything that had come before. The marriage had been real enough on paper, sealed with all the old rights and recorded in all the old registries, And yet in every way that a marriage might be said to live between two people, it had never begun at all, because Paul's heart belonged entirely and only to Chani. And Irulan had understood this from the very first night, when she had been shown to chambers of her own, gracious and comfortable and utterly separate from his. She had told herself, in those early years, that she could accept this arrangement, that a woman of her training could find purpose enough in being useful, in being present at the edges of history, even if she was never permitted to shape its center. And for a time, this had almost been true. Irulan was, after all, a woman of considerable gifts, trained by the Bene Gesserit in observation and patience and the careful management of her own face and voice. And she turned those gifts toward the writing of histories, toward the great chronicling project that would, in time, become the record by which most of the galaxy came to understand the reign of Muad'dib. She wrote of the jihad and its terrible cost. She wrote of the ecology of Arrakis and the slow dream of turning desert into garden. She wrote, in careful and measured prose, of the man she was married to and did not know, and in the writing she found a strange kind of intimacy with him that she could never have found in his private chambers, because on the page, at least, he could not turn away from her, could not vanish into Chani's arms and leave her standing in a doorway with her own thoughts for company. But a woman cannot live on the page forever. And as the years passed, and Chani remained at Paul's side in every hour that mattered, and the palace's true center of gravity settled ever more firmly around the Fremen woman and her fierce, quiet loyalty, Irulan felt her own position hollow out from within, the way a dune looks solid from a distance and yet gives way beneath a careless foot. She was empress in title only, honored at ceremonies, seated at the correct hand during formal audiences, dressed in the correct colors, and utterly without power in any room where the true decisions of the empire were made. She watched the Fremen commanders confer with Paul in low, urgent voices, and was not invited to join them. She watched Chani laugh softly at some private joke that passed between her and Paul in the old desert tongue, a joke Irulan had studied that language for years without ever being let close enough to understand from the inside. She was a historian recording a marriage that was not hers to have, and there is a particular loneliness in being asked to chronicle, with perfect accuracy and no bitterness permitted to show in the prose, the happiness of the woman who has taken the place a wife should have held. It would be easy, and false, to say that Irulan's slow drift toward conspiracy began in simple jealousy, because the truth was tangled with older and larger loyalties that had shaped her long before she ever set foot on Arrakis. She had been raised among the Bene Gesserit, trained from girlhood in their disciplines, bound to their long patient purposes even as she wore the crown of an empire the sisterhood had not fully chosen. The Bene Gesserit watched Paul Atreides with a wariness that had never fully softened, because he had emerged from their own breeding program only to slip free of their control entirely, becoming something the sisterhood had not planned for and could not easily predict. A man whose prescience let him see around the corners where their own considerable powers of observation could not reach. They had placed Irulan at his side in part to be their eyes and their patient hand within his household, and Irulan, whatever private grief she carried over her own barren marriage, had never fully set aside the training that made obedience to the sisterhood feel, even now, like breathing. And so when certain quiet approaches began to reach her, carried in the careful language that the powerful use when they wish to be understood without ever committing a plain word to memory, Irulan found herself listening in a way she might once have refused. She was approached, gently and by increments, by voices that spoke of restoring balance to an empire grown too dependent on one man's visions, of the dangers of letting prescience itself become the only law in the universe, of the many old and careful institutions, the Bene Gesserit, and the Spacing Guild, and the Tleilaxu with their strange gifts, all of whom found their own long purposes narrowed and threatened by the towering shadow Paul Atreides cast across every future they might otherwise have shaped. Irulan listened, and in her listening there was grief for her own wasted years as much as there was loyalty to the sisterhood that had raised her. And somewhere in that mixture of feeling, something that might have remained mere sorrow began, instead, to harden into intention. She did not think of herself, even now, as a traitor, because the word implied a simplicity her situation did not have. She told herself she sought only to correct an imbalance, to return some measure of restraint to a throne that had grown, in her private judgment, too vast and too strange for any single family or any single wife to bear safely. She told herself that Chani's happiness, however genuine, had been built upon her own erasure, and that a woman denied everything might be forgiven for wanting, at last, some hand in shaping what came next. And so quietly, in the careful language of letters that said one thing on their surface and another beneath, Irulan began to answer the voices that had reached out to her, and to become, without any dramatic turning point that she could later point to and name, one thread among several being drawn together into a single patient design. Up next in Chapter 8, The Conspiracy Gathers in the Shadows, we will step back from the palace and follow the wider threads of that design, the Bene Gesserit and the Spacing Guild and the Tleilaxu, each moving toward Paul's throne with purposes of their own, drawing slowly closer to the hour when their separate plans would finally meet. Far from the warm sands of Arrakis, in places where light itself moved differently, in chambers that smelled of melange and old stone, a conspiracy was gathering the way weather gathers, slowly, from many separate currents that did not at first appear to belong to the same storm. It had no single architect and no single beginning, and this was, perhaps, the truest thing about it, that it grew less from any one mind's cunning than from the quiet, patient convergence of several very old powers, each of whom had watched Paul Atreides rise from Duke's son to God Emperor, and had come, each in its own time and for its own reasons, to feel that rise as a kind of wound. Among the first to feel that wound was the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, and in particular the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam, an old woman whose face had grown as lined and patient as the deserts she had never loved, and who had once tested a young Paul Atreides with the terrible box that measured a person's humanity against their capacity for pain. She had believed then, as the sisterhood had believed for 10,000 years of careful breeding, that they were shaping a chosen one who would serve their long design, a design older than any single house or empire, meant to guide humankind gently toward its own improved future. Paul had passed her test, and had then done something no one in the sisterhood had planned for. He had slipped entirely free of their intended path, becoming the Kwisatz Haderach a full generation early and by the wrong bloodline's hand, and worse than early, becoming something that could see the sisterhood's own maneuvers coming from a great distance, the way a man on a hill sees riders long before they see him. Mohiam and her sisters had spent years since trying to find some way to bring this errant miracle back under a guiding hand, or, failing that, to see him removed before his jihad and his prescience reshaped humanity in a form the sisterhood had never intended and could not undo. Alongside the Bene Gesserit moved the Spacing Guild, that strange and essential order without whose navigators no ship could safely cross the great folded distances between the stars. The Guild's own navigator in these matters was called Edric, a creature so transformed by decades of exposure to the spice gas that he no longer resembled a man at all, floating instead within a tank of thick orange vapor, his body soft and finned, and utterly dependent on the very substance that Arrakis alone provided. The substance over which Paul now held absolute and terrible control. Edric's mind, altered by melange until it could fold space itself within its awareness, held one fear above all others: the fear that Paul's prescience might someday see clearly into the Guild's own carefully guarded secrets, might learn to navigate the folded paths between stars without any navigator's aid at all, and so remove the last necessity that gave the Guild its power and its survival. It was, for Edric, and for those he answered to, no longer a question of policy, but of continued existence. And creatures who fear for their existence will reach for allies wherever allies can be found, however strange the shapes those allies wear. And there were the Tleilaxu, stranger still, a people whose mastery of flesh and its endless malleability had made them both essential and feared across the whole of the Imperium. Among their number moved a face dancer named Scytale, a being whose own features shifted and reformed at will, so that he might wear the face of a trusted servant 1 hour and a stranger's face the next, always watching, always listening, never quite present as any single fixed person for long enough to be caught. The Tleilaxu produced Golas, those strange revived bodies grown from the cells of the dead and given back a portion of life, and they possessed knowledge of the body's deepest mysteries that no other power in the universe could match. Knowledge they guarded as jealously as the Guild guarded its navigators and the Sisterhood guarded its bloodlines. Scytale and his masters watched Paul's reign with the patient calculation of those who deal in long games measured across lifetimes rather than years, and they saw in the Emperor's grief, in the deep unhealed wound left by the death of his father and by the long war that had followed, an opportunity that no other conspirator in this gathering storm had yet thought to offer him. These three powers, the Sisterhood with its bloodlines, the Guild with its folded paths, the Tleilaxu with their mastery of flesh, moved toward one another slowly and with great caution, because each distrusted the others nearly as much as they distrusted Paul himself, and each hoped, in the private chambers of its own long calculations, to use the coming conspiracy for ends the other conspirators had not fully guessed. And into this careful, wary alliance came the fourth thread, quieter than the rest, and closer to home. The Princess Irulan, whose letters and whose careful silences had already begun to weave her into the design, offering these old and powerful strangers something none of them could easily obtain on their own, a set of eyes and ears within the very household of the Emperor himself, a wife's proximity without a wife's love, which made her, in the strange economy of conspiracy, worth more to them than any reverend mother's subtlety or any face dancer's borrowed face. What united these four so different powers was not friendship, and was barely even shared purpose, but a single point of convergence, a recognition that Paul Atreides, whatever else he was, remained a man, bound still to a man's grief and a man's need for love, and a man's inability to see every future with equal clarity, even as he claimed to see them all. If prescience made him nearly untouchable in the realm of ordinary plots and ordinary daggers, then perhaps the conspirators reasoned in their separate quiet councils. The way to reach him was not through violence at all, but through the oldest door in the world, through love itself, through the wound of losing someone irreplaceable, a wound that no vision of the future could fully soften, and no foreknowledge could entirely prevent. And so, in chambers scattered across the folded distances of the Imperium, in a Reverend Mother's private study, and in a tank of orange gas, and in rooms where a face dancer wore first one face, and then another, the shape of a gift began to take form. A gift meant to look, on its surface, like an act of mercy, and meant, beneath that surface, to open a door into the one place in Paul Atreides that even his own prescience could not fully guard. Up next, in Chapter 9, The Gift of Agola, we will see that gift arrive at last upon Arrakis, wrapped in the shape of a young man who should not have been able to exist at all. In the quiet hours, when the palace of Arrakeen settled into its long evening stillness, when the fountains that Paul had brought to Dune as proof of his abundance whispered their soft water song through corridors that had once known only sand, a gift arrived from the Bene Gesserit that would unsettle the Emperor more deeply than any army ever could. It came wrapped in courtesy and delivered with the studied humility the Tleilaxu always wore like a second skin, and it walked upright, and it breathed, and it wore the face of a friend who had died so many years before that grief for him had softened into something almost like an old scar, tender only when pressed. His name, they said, was hate. But those who had known Duncan Idaho, the loyal swordmaster of House Atreides, who had given his life in the training rooms of Arrakeen so that young Paul might escape the Harkonnen slaughter, could see the truth beneath the name the moment they looked into that face. It was Duncan's face, restored, remade, called back from the far side of death by the strange and terrible arts of the Tleilaxu axolotl tanks. Where flesh could be coaxed from cellular memory, the way a gardener might coax a dormant seed into bloom after a long winter. The body was Duncan's own, salvaged from the wreckage of his death, grown again in darkness, given breath and pulse and the slow blue stare of eyes that had been closed for a decade. They called such a creature Agola, and the word itself carried the hush of something forbidden, something that should not exist and yet did, standing quietly in the throne room with its hands folded and its manner serene, waiting to see what the Emperor of 1,000 Worlds would say to a dead man walking. Paul had already seen him coming, of course. Long before the ship carrying this gift touched down upon the sand, Paul's prescience had shown him fragments of this moment, glimpses caught in the great turning river of possible futures that flowed endlessly through his mind, and he had known that Duncan, or something wearing Duncan, would return to him one day, bearing both comfort and danger in the same breath. Even so, prepared as he was, the sight of that face struck something in him that no vision could fully soften. It is one thing to foresee a wound, and another to feel it open. The Tleilaxu had not sent hate out of kindness, and Paul understood this without needing his prescience to tell him so, for the Tleilaxu did nothing out of kindness. They were a people who dealt in flesh the way merchants dealt in spice, weighing every gift for its hidden price, and this gift, however precious it appeared, was also a kind of key they hoped might unlock something in the Emperor they could not reach by force. Agola, they knew, carried within it the deep echo of the original life it had been grown from, and though the old memories were said to sleep beneath layers of new conditioning, there were rumors, old and persistent, that certain Golas could be triggered to remember, and that whoever held the key to that awakening held a kind of power over the man who had once loved that face. And yet hate was, in himself, more than a weapon waiting to be turned. He had been given, along with Duncan's borrowed flesh, a new mind and a new training, for the Tleilaxu had shaped him as a Zensuni philosopher and as a mentat, one of those rare humans trained to hold vast calculations and subtle reasoning within an unaided mind, since the thinking machines of old had long been forbidden across the galaxy. Hate spoke slowly, and with a kind of patient wisdom, often circling a question 3 times before answering it, weighing words as a Fremen might weigh water, and there was something almost peaceful in his presence, a stillness that seemed to have been poured into him along with his new bones. Paul found himself drawn to that stillness, even as he distrusted its source. Here was a man who wore the shape of his oldest protector, who moved with something of Duncan's old grace, though tempered now by a philosopher's caution, and who spoke of loyalty and duty in ways that echoed, faintly, the man Paul had lost. It would have been easy, dangerously easy, to let himself believe that Duncan had truly returned, that death itself had been undone by some strange mercy, and to lean upon that belief the way a tired man leans upon an old friend's shoulder. But Paul knew better than to trust so simply. He had seen enough of the future's branching paths to know that comfort offered by an enemy is rarely comfort alone. Chani watched Hate with the wary eyes of a Fremen woman who had learned long ago that the desert punishes those who mistake a mirage for water, and she said little about him at first, only watching, only waiting, the way sand watches a boot before it decides whether to hold firm or give way. Alia, Paul's uncanny young sister, born already burdened with the accumulated awareness of the Bene Gesserit line through the same terrible transformation that had touched her mother in the womb, regarded the Gola with an unsettling directness, as though she were reading something written just beneath his skin, and Stilgar, the old Fremen Naib, who had become Paul's steadfast companion since the earliest days in the Sietch, simply distrusted anything that arrived wrapped so carefully in Tleilaxu paper, for he had learned that gifts from that quarter were seldom given without teeth hidden somewhere inside them. Still, Paul kept Hate near him, closer perhaps than caution alone would advise, for there was a part of the Emperor, worn thin by 12 years of rule and prophecy, and the terrible weight of watching a jihad spread his name across 100 worlds like fire through dry grass, that could not turn away from even the faint possibility of Duncan's return. Perhaps this, too, was something the Tleilaxu had understood before they ever sent their gift across the void, that a man burdened with every possible future might still be vulnerable to the simple human hope of seeing an old friend's face again, however that face had come to be remade. The philosopher Mentat walked the halls of Arrakeen in his soft gray robes, answering riddles with riddles, offering counsel that was often wiser than counsel had any right to be from a creature grown in a tank, and all the while the questions sat unspoken between him and the Emperor like a held breath. Was he a gift? Or a trap? Or a man reborn? Or perhaps, in some way, that not even Paul's prescience could fully untangle, all three at once. Somewhere in the shadowed places beyond the palace, where plots were stitched together with patience and cruelty in equal measure, others were already counting on the uncertainty that Hate's very presence created, waiting for the moment it might be turned to their advantage. Up next in Chapter 10, the Face Dancer and the Dwarf will follow the conspirators themselves into the dim rooms where their plans were taking shape, meeting the shape-shifting face dancer named Sightale, who could wear any face as easily as a cloak, and the small, strange mentat named Bijaz, whose gentle voice carried hidden commands folded quietly within it. Both of them threads in a design meant to unravel everything Paul had built. Far from the tall windows of the Arrakeen Palace, in rooms lit by lamps that never seemed to burn quite bright enough to chase away every shadow. The conspiracy against the emperor gathered its threads with the patience of spiders who had learned long ago that haste only tears a web before it can hold anything at all. Among those drawn together in this quiet and terrible work were two figures who seemed, at first glance, almost to belong to a different kind of story altogether. A shape-changer who wore other men's faces the way ordinary people wore cloaks, and a small, gentle-voiced dwarf whose mind held more calculation than his tiny frame ever let on. The shape-changer was named Scytale, and he was a face dancer, one of the strange and unsettling creations of the Bene Gesserit, bred and trained for a single uncanny purpose, to become, for a time, anyone at all. His own true face, when he allowed it to surface, was said to be a soft and characterless thing, a canvas rather than a portrait, smooth and unfinished, waiting always for some other identity to be poured over it like water into an empty vessel. He could take on the walk of a diplomat, the voice of a servant, the very posture and habit of a man who had lived an entire life somewhere else, and none but the most careful observer would ever notice the seams where the borrowed self had been stitched into place. It was a gift suited perfectly to conspiracy, for what better tool could plotters ask for than a man who could become anyone they needed him to be? Standing unnoticed in rooms where secrets were spoken, wearing the face of a trusted advisor one day and a humble merchant the next, moving through the empire like a rumor that never quite settled into a single shape. Scytale served the interests of his own people, the Tleilaxu, whose ambitions ran quiet and deep beneath the surface of the visible galaxy, and he had thrown in his lot with the others gathered against Paul, because the fall of Muad'dib, however it might be accomplished, promised to open doors that had long been closed to his kind. Beside him, in this shadowed alliance, stood a very different sort of instrument, a dwarf named Bijaz, whose small stature concealed a mind trained as precisely and rigorously as any mentat's, capable of holding long chains of calculation and subtle judgment the way other men held simple memories. But Bijaz was more than a calculating mind wrapped in an unusual body. He had been shaped, in ways that were never entirely explained even to those who used him, to carry within his soft and almost musical voice certain patterns of speech, certain rhythms and phrases that could reach past a listener's conscious guard and settle quietly into the deeper places of the mind, planting suggestions the way a gardener presses seeds into soil where they will not be seen again until they have already taken root. He spoke often in riddles and half-rhymes, in the playful, teasing cadence of a jester, and there was something almost endearing in his manner, a smallness and a softness that made it easy to underestimate the danger folded inside every sentence he offered. It was precisely this quality, this disarming gentleness, that made him so valuable to those who had trained him. For a man on his guard against threats rarely thinks to guard himself against a joke, or a rhyme, or the amused patter of someone who seems, on the surface, almost harmless. Together, Scytale and Bijaz represented two very different approaches to the same ancient art. The art of reaching a target who could not be reached by ordinary means, where the face dancer worked by becoming unseen, slipping past notice entirely by wearing whatever shape the moment required. The small mentat worked by being seen too clearly to be suspected, hiding his purpose in plain sight behind a performance of harmlessness. Both were pieces set upon a board by hands far more powerful than their own, for behind this conspiracy stood the ancient and patient order of the Bene Gesserit, who had watched their careful breeding program produce a man they could not fully control, and who now, sought, quietly, to correct that error. Behind it too stood the Spacing Guild, whose steersmen depended upon the spice for the very navigation that held the Empire's trade together, and who feared. With the cold clarity of those who see centuries at a glance, what an emperor with prescience of his own might do to their old monopoly on the safe crossing of the void. And moving through it all, in ways not always spoken aloud even among the conspirators themselves, was the presence of Princess Irulan, Paul's wife in name and title only, whose loyalty had been given first to her mother's order long before it was ever given, however reluctantly, to the man she had married. It is worth pausing here, in the hush of this telling, to notice how strange and how sad it is that a conspiracy so vast should be built not from open hatred, but from careful, patient disappointment, from the quiet grievances of powers who had each hoped to shape the future in their own image, and who found instead a man whose sight ran further than their schemes could follow. Scytale and Bijaz did not hate Paul, not in any simple sense. They served interests larger than themselves, the way water serves the shape of whatever container holds it, flowing wherever the walls of purpose directed them. Their task, as it slowly took form in those dim rooms of planning, involved the gift of hate, the Ghola whose borrowed face had already stirred such complicated feeling in the Emperor's heart. For a Ghola's mind, they believed, might yet be turned, its buried memories perhaps awakened at the right moment by the right words, spoken in the right voice, planted long before by patient hands, and their task involved as well a weapon so terrible that its very name was spoken only in careful whispers, a device capable of a violence forbidden across the great houses of the Empire, one that might be used not simply to kill a man, but to blind him, to strip away the one sense that had never failed him, even when every other certainty had grown uncertain. In the stillness of the palace above, Paul continued to walk his halls with hate at his side, unaware, or perhaps only partly aware, of exactly how the threads below were being drawn tighter around him. For even his prescience showed him rivers of possibility, rather than a single certain path, and there is a particular loneliness in seeing many futures and knowing that danger waits along more of them than safety does. Up next in Chapter 11, the Stone Burner and the Blinded Emperor will come at last to the terrible weapon the conspirators had gathered in secret, the forbidden device called a Stone Burner, and to the moment its atomic light would reach across a crowded gathering and take from Paul the one thing prescience alone could never fully replace, the simple gift of ordinary sight. There is a particular stillness that settles over a story just before its most terrible moment arrives, a hush not unlike the quiet that falls across the desert in the last breath before a great storm. And it was in just such a stillness that the conspiracy against Paul Atreides finally moved from whispered planning into open and irreversible action. The weapon they had gathered for this purpose was one so feared across the Imperium that its very existence was governed by the oldest and gravest of the Great Convention's laws, a device known as a stone burner, built around a fragment of atomic material coaxed into a violence unlike ordinary explosives. A light so fierce and so specific in its cruelty that it could be shaped to destroy sight, itself while leaving much of the body it touched still breathing. It was smuggled into a gathering where Paul stood among his court, a place where trust should have kept every danger at bay, and it was set loose in the manner such things are always set loose, suddenly, and without any final warning that ordinary senses could catch in time. Paul's prescience had shown him fragments of this moment across many long nights before it arrived, the way a man might see the shadow of a wave long before it breaks upon the shore, and yet foreseeing a thing and preventing it are not always the same power. For some futures narrow into certainty the way a wide river narrows into a single channel between stone walls, leaving little room to turn aside even for a man who can see the water coming. The stone burner's light broke across the gathering with a violence that scattered those nearby and left the air itself trembling with heat, and in that instant, Paul's eyes, along with the eyes of those closest to him, were seared by a brightness meant for exactly this cruelty. A light engineered not simply to burn, but to burn selectively, to reach into the delicate instruments of sight and undo them completely while sparing. By whatever mercy or calculation its makers had allowed, the deeper life of the body around them. When the light faded and the smoke and confusion began at last to clear, Paul remained alive, and this alone was more than the conspirators had perhaps expected. But he was alive in darkness, for his eyes had been destroyed entirely, burned past any hope of healing by even the most skilled physicians in the Imperium. The Emperor of 1,000 worlds, Muad'dib, the man whose name had carried the jihad like fire across 100 planets, stood now in a blindness as total and as ordinary as any that had ever befallen the poorest wanderer of the desert. And yet, in the same breath that took his sight, something else remained with him, something the stone burner's terrible light could never reach or touch. For Paul's prescience, that vast and burdened gift of seeing every possible future spread out before him like a great unrolled map, had never depended upon the simple mechanism of eyes at all. It lived deeper than that, woven into the very fabric of his awareness through the spice that had reshaped him since before his birth. And so even as his physical sight went dark forever, Paul found that he could still perceive the world around him, not through ordinary vision, but through the endless unfolding of possibility itself, seeing the shape of a room, the position of a guard, the fall of a shadow, all of it rendered to him not in light, but in the quiet certainty of foreknowledge. It was, in its own strange way, a kind of mercy laid over a terrible cruelty, though mercy is perhaps too gentle a word for something so complicated. The conspirators had meant, by this act, to strip Muad'dib of his power entirely, believing that a blind emperor could not long hold together an empire that depended so completely upon the awe his gaze and his presence commanded. Fremen custom, ancient and unbending in ways that reached back long before the coming of the Atreides to Arrakis, held that the blind were owed to the desert, given gently but firmly to Shai-Hulud. For a Fremen who could not see, could not read the sand, could not judge the wind, could not survive the 1,000 small dangers that the open dunes presented every single day, and so it had always been considered a mercy, in the harsh accounting of desert life, to release such a person to the sand rather than let them linger uselessly among the living. Paul understood, even as he stood in the smoke and the ruin of that terrible gathering, that this custom now stood between him and the throne he had bled to win, for even an emperor could not entirely escape the deep and ancient logic of the people who had made him what he was. But he understood something else as well, something his prescience had perhaps always been quietly preparing him to know, that his blindness need not mean the end others hoped it would bring, for a man who could see every road before it was walked had little true need of the roads his eyes might once have shown him. Word of the stone burner's use spread quickly, and with the particular horror such news always carries. For a weapon of that kind, forbidden across every house and every world by treaties older than most living memories, had never before been turned so directly against an emperor. and its use marked a boundary crossed that could not easily be uncrossed again. Those who had planned this cruelty waited now, in their shadowed rooms, to see whether the blindness they had inflicted would finally break the man they could not otherwise defeat, or whether muad'dib, in the peculiar and terrible strangeness of his gift, would simply continue forward as though the darkness itself had never fallen upon him at all. Chani, who had not been harmed in the attack, stayed close in the hours that followed, her Fremen composure holding steady even as grief and fear moved beneath it, and Stilgar kept his own watch nearby, gruff and unshakable, refusing to let the old custom of the desert take from him the man he had followed since the earliest days of the jihad. And somewhere in the quiet dark that had become Paul's constant companion, the Emperor began, almost at once, to demonstrate something that would unsettle friend and enemy alike in the days that followed, moving through his own palace with a sureness that no blind man should have possessed, reaching for a cup before a servant had even lifted it, turning to face a door before it had opened, as though his eyes, though gone, had simply been replaced by something even more complete. Up next in Chapter 12, Seeing the World Without Eyes, we'll follow Paul deeper into this strange new existence, watching him move through Arrakeen guided entirely by the endless unfolding of prescience, and we'll come to understand why, even surrounded by loyal friends, the old Fremen custom concerning the blind would not simply be forgotten, however much love stood in its way. In the long, quiet days that followed the stone burner's terrible light, the people of Arrakeen began to notice something that unsettled them even more deeply than the news of the Emperor's blindness had first done. For muad'dib moved through his own palace as though nothing at all had been taken from him. He walked the wide corridors without a guiding hand, turned to greet visitors before they had spoken a word, reached for a cup of spice coffee before a servant had finished pouring it, and stepped around obstacles in his path with the same easy confidence he had always shown, as though his eyes still rested clearly upon the world around him rather than lying dark and ruined within his own skull. This was, of course, the strange gift and burden of his prescience, that vast awareness of possible futures that had been growing within him since long before his birth, shaped by the spice that saturated the air and the sand, and the very bread of Arrakis, and shaped further by the terrible sacrifices of the jihad and the visions he had suffered and welcomed and feared in equal measure across 12 long years of rule. Where an ordinary blind man must learn to read the world through sound and touch and the careful memory of a room's furniture, Paul instead perceived the unfolding of time itself, seeing not the present moment through borrowed senses, but the near future rushing toward him along countless threads, each one showing him where a door would be, where a step would fall, where a hand would reach, so that by the time any of it became the present, he had already lived it once in the quiet theater of his foresight. It was a strange thing to hold in the mind, this idea that a man could see by seeing ahead, that darkness in the eyes could be answered not by silence, but by an entire river of futures flowing constantly through awareness, showing him the shape of what was coming before it ever arrived to be seen in the ordinary way. Those who attended him in these days often found it unsettling to watch, for there is something in the human heart that expects blindness to bring hesitation, a testing hand along a wall, a pause before a threshold, and Paul offered none of that hesitation at all, moving instead with the same unbroken certainty he had always carried, as though the darkness were simply another kind of light he alone had learned to read. And yet, for all the uncanny completeness of this gift, it remained, in its own way, a lonely kind of sight. For prescience did not restore to him the small, unconsidered pleasures that ordinary vision offers without ever announcing itself as a gift. The simple color of a sunset over the shield wall, the particular fondness in a familiar face caught unexpectedly in a doorway, the quiet, wordless comfort of simply looking upon someone loved without any labor of foresight required to do so. What Paul possessed instead was a knowing that arrived always through effort and always through the vast and exhausting work of holding countless futures in mind at once. And there is a difference, subtle but real, between seeing a thing and calculating that a thing will soon be there to see. It was into this strangeness that the old customs of the Fremen pressed themselves, quietly but insistently, for the desert people who had first sheltered a young Paul Atreides and later crowned him their muad'dib, held ancient and unbending beliefs about blindness. Beliefs shaped across countless generations of survival upon a planet that forgave no weakness and rewarded no comfort given without purpose. Among the Fremen, it had long been understood that a man who could no longer see the sand, who could no longer read the wind for its warning, or judge the color of the sky for the coming of a storm, could not long survive among the dunes, and so such a man was given, gently and without cruelty in the Fremen understanding of the word, to the desert itself, released to walk out into Shai Hulud's domain and find whatever ending waited for him there. This custom did not simply vanish because the man now blind happened to be their emperor. For the deepest laws of a people are rarely set aside even for someone they love and revere, and there were many among the Fremen nabes, watching Paul move with his uncanny surety through the palace, who wondered quietly among themselves whether the tradition of their ancestors ought still to apply to muad'dib as it had always applied to any other blinded man among them. Stilgar, who loved Paul as he might have loved a son, wrestled visibly with this old law, torn between the loyalty that had carried him through so many years at Paul's side and the deep, bone-set instincts of a Fremen naib who had spent his whole life honoring the customs that kept his people alive upon the sand. Paul, for his part, seemed to carry no fear of this old custom, and there was even, in the quiet hours when he spoke with those closest to him, a certain peace in how he regarded it, as though he understood something about his own path that made the ancient law feel less like a threat and more like simply one more thread among the many futures he had already glimpsed and measured and made his. Peace with, long before the stone burner's light had ever touched him. He continued to hold his throne, to receive his petitioners, to move through his court with the calm and unbroken confidence that had always marked him, and if there was, somewhere behind that calm, a private reckoning with all that his blindness might yet demand of him, he kept it as quietly as he kept so much else, folded away behind the patient stillness that had become his most enduring mask. Chani watched him in these days with the steady, unwavering attention of a woman who had shared his bed and his burdens since the earliest years of the jihad, and though she said little of the old Fremen law aloud, it lived nonetheless in the careful way she stayed near him, in the quiet vigilance with which she moved through rooms at his side, as though her presence alone might hold back whatever the desert's ancient customs still hoped to claim. Up next in Chapter 13, Chani and the Return to the Desert, we'll follow Chani as she turns once more toward the wide, familiar sands that had first shaped her, seeking there, in the old rhythms of Fremen life, a way to carry both her love for Paul and her yearning, long deferred, for a child of her own. There came a season, quiet and unannounced, when the Emperor of 1,000 Worlds turned his back upon the throne room of Arrakeen and walked instead toward the deep desert. toward the place where he had once been only a boy, learning to survive among strangers. Paul Atreides, who was muad'dib to the faithful, and usul to the few who had known him before the jihad had swallowed the galaxy in his name, went south with Chani to the sietch called Tabor, the same rock and cavern home where the Fremen had first taken him in and taught him the ways of the sand. It was not an escape, though it felt like one to those who watched him go. It was something closer to a return. The kind of return a man makes near the middle of his life when the noise of empire grows too loud to hear his own thoughts inside it. The sietch received them the way the desert always received those who understood it, without ceremony, without softness, simply opening itself to two more lives among the many it already sheltered. Chani walked those corridors as she had walked them since childhood, sure-footed on stone that remembered her, and Paul walked beside her, no longer entirely the young outworlder who had first stumbled through these passages, but not yet fully the distant god that a billion pilgrims imagined when they spoke his titles across 1,000 light years. Here, in the half-dark beneath the rock, he was allowed for a while to be simply a man with a wife, and the desert allowed it too, because the desert has never cared for crowns. For years the pair had lived under a private sorrow that neither spoke of often, though it lived in the space between their words at night. Chani had taken the Suboxone treatments, the fertility suppressants long used in secret by concubines and consorts of great houses to protect against unwanted heirs, or against heirs too dangerous to name. It had been Chani's own choice at first, and later something Paul had let stand, because the future he saw in his terrible visions did not always show him a child arriving safely, and there were futures glimpsed in that shifting fog of prescience that no father could welcome without dread. But time is patient in ways that emperors are not, and something had shifted in Paul's private calculations, some narrowing of the vast branching paths ahead, and the order had gone out quietly, through channels that even the palace scarcely noticed, that the Suboxone was to be replaced. In its place came the old Fremen fertility diet, the Malang rich foods, and the ritual preparations the desert people had used for generations to ready a woman's body for the bearing of children, a diet as old as the sietches themselves, entwined with observances that predated even the coming of the Bene Gesserit to Arrakis. Chani did not ask why the order had changed, not at first, though she was Fremen enough to notice everything, and wife enough to Paul to sense that some vision had moved him toward it. She simply accepted the change the way she accepted the turning of the seasons on a planet that seemed to have none, with the quiet trust of a woman who had long ago decided that her life belonged beside this man's, wherever the path led, whatever shape the future wished to take. She had loved him since the cave at the beginning of everything, since before he was emperor, since before the name muad'dib had ever been spoken by anyone but the small, close circle of the Fremen who first called him brother. Whatever this new turning meant, she would walk it as she walked the sand, without complaint, with her eyes open. And so the days at Sietch Tabor took on a rhythm gentler than anything the throne allowed. Paul rose in the mornings and walked the high ledges where the wind came scoured clean across leagues of dune, and he watched the light change on the sand the way he had watched it as a youth, back when the future had still felt like something he might choose rather than something he was compelled to endure. Chani worked among the women of the sietch, tending the water rings, mending stillsuits, teaching the younger ones the old songs that told of Shai Hulud and the coming of the Lisan al-Gaib, though she herself had never fully believed the religion that had grown up around her husband, not the way the pilgrims believed it. She loved the man. She had never needed the myth. It was in this season of quiet that Chani first felt within her the change that both of them had, in their separate and private ways, begun to expect. She woke one morning before the false dawn and lay still in the dark, aware of her own body in a way she had not been aware of it in years, and she understood, before any physician could confirm it, that the long emptiness was ending, that something new had begun to take root inside her. She said nothing to Paul immediately, holding the knowledge close for a day, turning it over the way one turns over a stone found in the sand, checking it for weight and truth, before at last she told him, in the hush of their own chamber, away from the ears of attendants and advisors, that she believed herself with child. Paul received the news the way he received all things now, with a stillness that concealed depths no one else could measure, for he was a man who had walked so far into the terrible clarity of his own prescience that ordinary joy no longer arrived unaccompanied. Even as he held Chani and let himself feel, for a moment, the plain human happiness that any husband might feel at such news. Some other part of him, the part that had eaten the spice of 2 deserts and seen the branching futures fan out before him, like the veins of a great leaf, felt also the small, cold breath of foreboding that had followed him since the day he first drank the water of life. He did not speak of it to her. There are burdens a man carries alone, precisely because to share them would be to make someone else carry them too. And Paul had spent his whole reign learning which weights could be set down and which could not. The desert, meanwhile, continued exactly as it always had, indifferent and eternal, its great worms moving beneath the dunes like slow gods turning in their sleep, its wind erasing every footprint by morning, as though to remind the 2 humans sheltering within it that no matter how vast their empire had grown, this planet had existed long before either of them, and would go on existing long after. Chani walked out sometimes in the cool of early evening to stand at the lip of the Sayach entrance and look out over that endless ocean of sand, her hand resting, without thought, upon the place where new life was beginning, and she felt something she could not name, not fear exactly, and not simple hope either, but a kind of readiness. The readiness of a woman who has lived her whole existence beneath an open, dangerous sky and has never once expected safety to be given to her for free. Paul, watching her from the shadow of the entrance, allowed himself in that moment to set aside, however briefly, the weight of every possible future, and to simply watch his wife watching the desert, and to hope, in the small human way that even a god emperor is permitted to hope, that this one thread among all the shining, terrible threads of what might come would be gentle to them both. Up next in Chapter 14, The Birth of the Twins, we will follow Chani through the long months that came after, to the astonishing morning when the Sayach discovered that the child they had waited for had, in truth, never been only one child at all. The months that followed Chani's discovery passed at Sayach Tabor in a slow, sand-warmed rhythm, the kind of time that seems, in the deep desert, to move differently than it does anywhere else in the Imperium, stretched thin across long silent days and short cold nights, marked less by calendars than by the changing weight of Chani's body and the quiet attentions of the Sayach women who had delivered generations of Fremen children beneath that same rock. Paul divided himself, as he always had, between the distant obligations of an empire that could not simply pause because its emperor wished to be a husband for a season, and the small, guarded hours he kept for himself in the Sayach, hours in which he tried, not always successfully, to set aside the visions that crowded his waking mind, and simply be present beside the woman carrying his child. He watched her closely in ways that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with love, though the fear was there too, folded in beneath the love the way a blade is folded into a sheath, present but not drawn. Chani grew heavier through the long weeks, and there was something in the particular shape and heaviness of her that struck the older Sietch women as unusual, though none of them said so aloud in her hearing, trading only quiet glances among themselves, the kind of glances that women who have attended many births exchange when they sense that this labor, whenever it comes, will not be an ordinary one. Chani herself felt it too, a fullness that seemed greater than what she remembered from other women's accounts of a single child, a stirring that seemed, at times, to come from more than one small place within her, though she said nothing of this either, holding it close the way she had always held the private knowledge of her own body. Paul, with his terrible gift of sight, may have known before anyone else what was coming, may have glimpsed it in the tangled skein of futures he carried behind his ruined and burdened eyes, though, if he knew, he kept the knowledge to himself, unwilling to rob his wife of an ordinary mother's anticipation by naming ahead of time a truth that the body itself would soon reveal. There are things prescience allows a man to see and yet not speak, and the coming of his own children may have been one of the harder silences he kept in all his difficult reign. When Chani's time finally came, it came the way births had always come to the women of the Sietch, with the ancient hands of Fremen midwives in attendance, women skilled in a craft far older than the Imperium itself, women who had eased countless children into the dry air of the caverns beneath Arrakis. Paul stayed near as custom and his own need would allow, pacing the outer chambers, feeling for the first time in years something like ordinary helplessness. The particular helplessness of a man who cannot enter fully into the labor his wife must carry alone. And then, in the deep hours before what would have been dawn beneath an open sky, the first cry came, small and outraged and entirely alive, and the midwives' voices rose in a sudden confusion of exclamation that was not distress but astonishment. For no sooner had the first child been delivered, a boy, red-faced and already impossibly aware in his dark new eyes, than the attendants realized with growing wonder that Chani's labor was not yet finished, that a second child remained, that what the Sietch had prepared for as one birth had, all along, secretly, been two. A girl followed her brother into the world within the hour, as fierce in her first cry as he had been, and the Sietch that night rang quietly, in its hushed underground way, with the particular joy that only a birth long awaited can bring, doubled now, unexpectedly, into two. They named the boy Leto, after Paul's own father, the Duke who had died at the hands of the Harkonnens and the Emperor's treachery so many years before on this very planet, a name meant to carry forward memory and honor across the gulf of that old grief. They named the girl Ghanima, a Fremen word that speaks of something won in war, something seized back from the enemy and kept, a fitting name for a child born to an emperor who had built his throne from the wreckage of a jihad that had already claimed more lives than any war in human memory. But the joy of that night, real as it was, carried within it a strangeness the Sietch women recognized at once, and spoke of only in careful whispers among themselves, for these were not ordinary infants. Because Chani had eaten so deeply of the spice throughout her pregnancy, and because the melange had shaped these children within her womb in ways it did not shape ordinary children, both Leto and Ghanima arrived in the world already possessed of an awareness that no newborn should carry, their small eyes tracking the movements of the adults around them with a clarity too old for their tiny bodies, their minds. It would become clear in the days and weeks to come, already alive with the accumulated memory of countless ancestral lives. Exactly as it had happened years before, with Alia, Paul's own sister, who had been born preborn in the womb of Lady Jessica, after she too had been steeped in the spice essence during the crisis at the Water of Life. This was the burden and the gift the twins carried into the world from their very first breath, a burden their Aunt Alia already knew intimately and had lived with since her own strange infancy. The burden of consciousness without childhood, of memory without the mercy of forgetting, of being born already aware of countless lives that were not their own layered beneath their own small emerging, selves like sediment beneath a single grain of new sand. It was a gift no parent would have chosen freely for a child, and yet it was the gift Paul's long reign upon the throne of spice had already prepared for them before they ever drew breath. The same gift and curse that had shaped his own sister, and in its way, shaped the entire Atreides line since Jessica had first defied the Bene Gesserit's careful breeding plan to bear a son of love rather than of political calculation. Paul held his children that first night, one small warm weight in each arm, and felt, even amid the aching tenderness of the moment, the cold undertow of his prescience stirring beneath the surface of his joy. Glimpses of futures in which these two small lives would carry burdens heavier than any father could wish upon them, burdens of memory and destiny that would follow them long after his own reign had ended. He said nothing of this to Chani, who lay exhausted and radiant in the aftermath of the double birth, her face lit with a happiness unclouded by foresight, a happiness Paul allowed himself, for that single night, to share fully and without shadow, setting aside for a few precious hours the terrible weight of everything he had already seen coming. Yet even joy this complete carries its own quiet undertow in a life shaped as thoroughly by prescience as Paul's had been, and somewhere beneath the warmth of that first night with his newborn son and daughter, a colder truth waited its turn to surface. A truth about the cost that Chani's body had already paid across the long months of preparing to carry not one child but two. Up next in Chapter 15, The Death of Chani, we will follow the days that came after the twins' birth, when the joy of the Sietch gave way to a grief that would change the emperor of the known universe forever. In the quiet hours after a birth, even a difficult one, there is usually a kind of settling, a sense that the hardest labor has passed, and what remains is only rest and recovery, and for a short while the Sietch believed this was true for Chani as well, that she would rise from her exhaustion the way the Fremen women always rose, weathered but whole, ready to nurse her children and take up her place among the Sietch once more. But the years of Suboxxa, the long secret suppression of her own fertility that had shielded her body from childbearing for so long, had left something altered and fragile within her in ways that no one, not even Paul with all his terrible sight, had fully reckoned with. And the sudden demand of carrying not one child, but two upon a body unaccustomed after so long to such a burden had drawn upon reserves of strength that simply were not there to be drawn upon any longer. She weakened in the days that followed the twins' birth, slowly at first, in ways that might have been mistaken for the ordinary tiredness of any new mother, and then more visibly, until even those who loved her most and wished hardest not to see it could no longer pretend that what was happening to Chani was ordinary at all. The midwives of Sietch Tabor, women who had guided countless Fremen mothers safely through recovery, worked over her with every skill and every remedy the desert people possessed. But there are some depletions that no poultice or prayer can restore, and Chani's body, having given everything it had to bring Leto and Ghanima safely into the world, had little left with which to heal itself. Paul stayed beside her through those final days, in a way that no ceremony of empire could have pulled him from. Setting aside the endless demands of the throne, the petitioners and the priests, and the vast administrative weight of a jihad still burning across 1,000 worlds, all of it reduced suddenly to nothing beside the smaller, more urgent reality of his wife's failing breath. He who could see the branching pathways of 1 billion possible futures found himself, in this one matter above all others, unable to change what was coming. For even a prescient emperor cannot rewrite the frailty of a human body once its course has been set in motion. And Paul had perhaps always known, in some deep, unspoken chamber of his foresight, that this was among the futures he could not bend, however far his gift extended. Chani died in the Sayach that had sheltered her whole life, surrounded by the rock and sand she had always loved more than any palace, with her newborn children nearby, and her husband close enough to hold her hand until the very end. She died a Fremen death, plain and without grandeur, for all that she had been the beloved of an emperor, worshipped across the stars as a living god, and there was a kind of terrible fittingness in that plainness, since Chani herself had never wanted the worship, had never cared for the titles heaped upon Paul by the faithful, had only ever wanted the man she had first known in the deep desert, before any of it began. The grief that came over Paul in the days after was of a different order than any sorrow he had known before, deeper even than the grief he had carried for his father the Duke, deeper than the private losses that had marked his strange and violent rise to power. Chani had been the one true anchor holding him to his own humanity through all the long years of jihad and worship and prescient dread, the one person beside whom he had never needed to be muad'dib, or the lisan al-ghaib, or any of the vast borrowed names the galaxy had draped across his shoulders, the one person who had simply loved Usul, the man, without asking anything more of him than his presence. With her gone, something in Paul that had held firm through every previous trial seemed at last to come loose from its moorings, a sense of an ending that stretched wider than the loss of one woman, though the loss of that one woman was already more than any heart should have to carry. He did not weep the way lesser men wept, not before the Sayach, for an emperor's grief must always be measured against the watching eyes of a world that expects him to remain more than merely human, but those closest to him. The few who could read the small signs beneath his composed and weathered face understood that Paul Atreides had been struck in this hour by a wound from which he might never fully recover, a wound made only heavier by the presence of the 2 small children left behind, infants already carrying the terrible pre-born awareness that Chani herself had not lived to see fully unfold in them. In the Sietch, the Fremen mourned Chani in their own fashion, honoring the water of her body as the desert people had always honored the water of the dead, for water was life on Arrakis, and the loss of any life was measured, in the old ways, by the water it returned to the tribe. Paul, standing over that solemn observance, felt keenly the strange distance between the ancient, plain rites of his adopted people and the vast, glittering theology that had grown up around his own name across the Imperium, a theology that would soon enough transform even Chani's death into scripture, into a sorrow retold by countless pilgrims who had never known her, who would weep for a myth rather than for the woman herself. And somewhere in the Sayach during those raw and unsteady days, unnoticed at first amid the greater weight of grief, another current was quietly gathering, a current that had nothing to do with mourning and everything to do with old conspiracies long patient in the shadows. Among Paul's household stood the Gola called Hate, the strange resurrected form of a man once known as Duncan Idaho, restored from death by Tleilaxu artifice and given back to Paul as a gift whose true purpose had never been entirely clear. And within that Gola's altered mind, a compulsion planted by the dwarf Bijas had begun, in the aftermath of Chani's death, to stir and press toward the surface, a compulsion aimed, in the end, at the life of the Emperor himself. Up next in Chapter 16, the Gola remembers his name. We will follow Hate through the hours when grief and hidden command collided within him, and discover how the man he had once been at last began to return. Within the household of the grieving emperor there lived a man who was not entirely a man in the ordinary sense, a figure known to the court as Hate. Tall and grave and philosophical in his bearing, his eyes replaced long ago with the metallic gleam of Tleilaxu artifice, his very existence a puzzle that had occupied the whispered speculation of Arakeen for years. Hate was a Gola, a body regrown from the dead flesh cells of a man who had perished long before, restored through the secret arts of the Bene Tleilax on their hidden world. And the flesh that had been regrown into Hate had once belonged to Duncan Idaho, the loyal swordmaster of House Atreides, who had died defending young Paul during the fall of Arakeen so many years before, cut down by Sardaukar blades so that his young master might escape into the desert and live to become muad'dib. The Tleilaxu had given this Gola as a gift to Paul, wrapped in all the uncertainty that such gifts from such givers always carried. For a gift from the Bene Tleilax was never simply a gift, and Paul, with his terrible foresight, had accepted Hate into his household knowing full well that some hidden purpose lay folded inside the offering like a blade inside a sleeve, though even his prescience could not always tell him precisely when or how that blade would be drawn. Hate himself, through all his years of service, had believed himself to be only Hate, a philosopher and mentat of quiet dignity, his Gola conditioning having sealed away the memories of the man he had once been beneath layers of Tleilaxu programming so thorough that even he did not know what he did not know. But hidden within Hate, planted by the twisted genius of the dwarf Bajaz during a period of captivity that had unsettled the whole court, there lay a compulsion, a deep-buried command meant to trigger at the moment of greatest emotional strain, a command that would drive the Gola, against whatever remained of his own will, to turn upon Paul and destroy him. This had been the true purpose behind the gift all along, the patient work of the conspiracy that had gathered in the shadows around Paul's throne, the Bene Gesserit, and the Spacing Guild, and the Bene Tleilax, and the deposed Princess Irulan's own tangled loyalties, all woven together into a single design meant to bring down the Emperor, who had disrupted every one of their ancient plans. The death of Chani, arriving as it did in a wave of grief that shook the household to its foundations, proved to be precisely the kind of strain the conspirators had hoped for, and in the raw days that followed her passing, the compulsion buried in Hate began to press up through the careful layers of his conditioning, like a root forcing its way through stone. He felt it as a growing pressure behind his metal eyes, an urge whose origin he could not name, a darkness moving through him that seemed to want something terrible of his own hands, something aimed, with a horror he could barely comprehend, at the very man he had served faithfully and, in whatever way a Gola could love, had come to love as a kind of son might love a father he had once protected. Hate fought this rising compulsion in the only way available to him, through the discipline of his mentat training and the philosophical steadiness that had always been his most defining quality even in his artificial life. Turning the pressure over and over in his mind, the way a mentat turns any difficult problem, searching for the shape of the trap that had been built inside him. And in that searching, in that terrible pressure of a mind fighting against its own hidden architecture, something else began to happen. Something the Tleilaxu conditioning had never fully anticipated, for the compulsion itself, in forcing hate to confront the depths of his own buried mind, loosened the very walls that had kept the true memories sealed away. It began as fragments, images without context, the flash of a training hall long since destroyed, the memory of a young boy's laughter echoing through the halls of Castle Caledon, a duke's voice speaking words of trust and command, and slowly, painfully, across hours that felt to hate like the unraveling of his entire existence, the fragments joined themselves into a whole. And the man called Hate understood at last, with a shock that ran through his artificial body like a current, that he was not merely a philosopher grown from dead flesh, but that he had once, in another life entirely, been Duncan Idaho, swordmaster of House Atreides, sworn protector of the family that had raised Paul from infancy, a man who had died on this very planet defending the boy who would become emperor. The return of that old identity broke something in the compulsion that Bijas had planted, for Duncan Idaho's loyalty to House Atreides ran deeper than any Tleilaxu programming could reach, deeper even than the layers of philosophical conditioning that had been built atop his regrown flesh. And in remembering who he truly was, Duncan found within himself the strength to seize control of the very impulse that had been meant to destroy the man he loved. He stood in the quiet of his own chambers in the hours after this terrible remembering, feeling the ghost of his old self settle back into the shape of his restored body, feeling the weight of decades he had not lived through, and yet somehow still carried within him, the strange doubled awareness of a man who is both newly born and impossibly old. When at last he went before Paul, it was no longer Hate the philosopher who walked those halls, careful and formal and uncertain of his own depths, but Duncan Idaho himself, restored in memory if not entirely in the years his body had lived, a man returning at last to the family he had died protecting so long ago, carrying with him both the danger that had been planted inside him and the fierce old loyalty that had, in the end, proven stronger than any conspiracy could have accounted for. Paul, grieving still for Chani, received this transformed and returning friend with an exhaustion too deep for simple astonishment, though even in his sorrow he understood the significance of what stood before him, a piece of his oldest and most painful past given back to him whole in the very week he had lost the dearest companion of his adult life. Yet even as Duncan's return brought Paul a fragile comfort in the midst of his mourning, the conspiracy that had shaped the Gola's hidden purpose had not been defeated so much as delayed, for the same shadowed alliance of Bene Gesserit ambition and Tleilaxu cunning and guild calculation that had built the trap within Duncan had other designs still waiting in reserve. Offers and bargains meant to be placed before the grieving emperor, in the hope that sorrow might make him vulnerable where strength never had. Up next in Chapter 17, The Bargain That Was Refused, we will follow the offer that the conspirators brought before Paul in his grief, and the answer he gave them in return. Deep beneath the palace of Muad'dib, in chambers where the air itself seemed to hold its breath, a visitor waited who was not what he appeared to be, for he was Scytale, a face dancer of the Bene Tleilax, and the face he wore that day was borrowed, smooth, and patient, the way still water is patient before it is troubled. He had come, as all such visitors came, wrapped in the language of gifts, though what he carried was not a gift at all, but a hook baited with the one thing no emperor, however powerful, however burdened with the sight of every possible future, could easily refuse. He carried the memory of a woman who had died, and he offered to give her back. Paul Atreides, who was muad'dib to 10 billion believers, and usul to the few who remembered the desert that made him, received this visitor in a room lit softly, where shadows lay long and unhurried across the floor. And he listened, as he always listened, with the stillness of a man who had already seen the shape of the conversation before the first word was spoken. This was the curse and the strange mercy of his prescience, that so little truly surprised him anymore, that the paths of the future lay before him like the furrows of a great field already plowed. And yet, even a man who can see the harvest before the seed is planted may still feel the ache of wanting to eat the fruit before its season. Scytale understood this ache better than most, for the Tleilaxu were patient students of desire, and they had built their entire art upon the quiet, terrible knowledge that grief does not care how much a man can foresee. The offer, when it came gently, the way poison is gentle, dissolved so completely into a cup of wine that the drinker tastes only sweetness. Scytale spoke of the tanks of the Bene Tleilax, those deep vats where flesh could be coaxed back from cells long kept, where a body could be built again upon the pattern of one who had lived and died. And he spoke of a gola, that strange and sorrowful invention that was neither quite the resurrection of the dead nor a wholly separate being, but something suspended between the two, wearing a beloved face, walking with a beloved gait, carrying, perhaps, buried somewhere beneath layers of new flesh and careful conditioning, fragments of a beloved self. And the gola he offered was not some soldier or scholar. It was Chani. It was the shape of the woman Paul had loved in the desert nights of Sietch Tabor and beneath the open sky of Arrakis, the woman who had borne him grief before she bore him joy, the woman whose name he had spoken in the last private hour before the world took her from him. Scytale did not need to describe her in detail, for Paul's memory did that work far better than any Tleilaxu tongue could manage, summoning without effort the particular tilt of her head when she considered a question she did not wish to answer too quickly, the low warmth of her voice in the hours before dawn, the way her hands had once moved across a worn kaif in the Sietch as though the fabric itself deserved patience. All of this rose in him unbidden, the way water rises in a qanat when the gates are opened, and for a moment, brief as a held breath, the offer glittered before him with a terrible, understandable beauty. To have her walk again, to hear, even from lips grown in a tank rather than born of a mother, some echo of the voice he had lost. It was a temptation built with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of a merchant, for the Tleilaxu did not deal in miracles out of love. They dealt in miracles because miracles are the most expensive currency there is, and they intended to be paid in full. The price, of course, was not gold, nor spice, nor any tribute an emperor might casually spend from his treasury. The price was Paul himself, and everything that moved beneath his hand across the reaches of the Imperium. Scytale asked, in words wrapped as softly as the offer itself, that Paul surrender, that he lay down the throne won at such terrible cost, that he yield the jihad and its endless engines of conquest, that he place himself and his empire into the keeping of those who would then decide, at their leisure and to their own advantage, what became of a Fremen prophet who had once commanded the fate of 100 worlds. It was not truly an offer to restore a wife. It was an offer to purchase an empire with the one coin an emperor cannot spend without becoming something less than himself, the coin of grief, minted from love. And Scytale knew, as all careful merchants know, that grief is the currency people spend most recklessly when it is placed directly before them. Paul sat with this for a long while, And in that stillness, the future opened for him again in its endless branching corridors, showing him, as it so often did, more than one man should ever be asked to carry. He saw paths where he reached for the offer, and paths where he refused it, and in neither did the ache in his chest grow smaller, for prescience had never once made him immune to sorrow. Only aware of its many shapes in advance, he understood, with the clarity that had both blessed and ruined him, that what Scytale offered was not truly Chani at all, but a vessel wearing her memory the way a lantern wears its glass. Something that might glow with her shape, but would never again hold the woman who had chosen him freely beneath the desert stars, who had loved him before he was anyone's god, who had died as herself and not as a bargaining piece in a Tleilaxu ledger. To accept would be to trade the truth of her death for a counterfeit of her life, and to hand over, in the same terrible transaction, everything that made him free enough to have loved her in the first place. And so, quietly, without anger, without the theater that lesser men might have brought to such a refusal, Paul Atreides said no. He said it the way a man closes a door against a wind he has already felt coming, gently, but completely, and he did not pretend the choice cost him nothing, for even an emperor who could see the future was not permitted to lie to himself about the past. Scytale withdrew, unruffled, for the Tleilaxu were patient beyond the patience of ordinary men, and patience, after all, is simply another word for waiting until the next offer might be better received. Up next in Chapter 18, the Emperor walks into the sand. We will follow Muad'dib as the last of his sight leaves him, and as he turns, blind and unafraid, toward the deep desert that had first named him, and would now, in the oldest Fremen way, receive him home. There came a morning, quiet as any other morning, when the light of Arrakis fell across the palace, and Paul Atreides understood. With the calm of a man reading a sentence he had already written for himself long ago, that the last of his sight was leaving him. Not the sight of ordinary eyes, though that too had been taken from him in the violence of the stone burner, its terrible light scouring away the world of common seeing and leaving him to walk for a long while on the strength of prescience alone, borrowing the shape of the future to stand in for the shape of the present. But now, at last, even that inner light was dimming, the long corridors of possible time growing thin and gray at their edges, the way a lamp grows dim, not all at once, but by degrees, until a man realizes only afterward how long he has been sitting in the dark. For years he had walked among his court and his petitioners, among generals and priestesses and the endless procession of those who came to bargain with the mind of muad'dib, and he had done this without truly seeing any of them with his own eyes, relying instead on the flow of prescient time to tell him where a step must fall, where a hand waited to be met, where a face turned toward him in hope or fear. It had been, in its own way, a kind of grace, terrible and exhausting, but a grace nonetheless, allowing him to move through a blindness that the world around him never fully perceived. He had learned, in those years, to read the small sounds of a room the way another man might read a face. The shift of cloth, the held breath before a difficult question, the faint change in the air when someone stepped nearer than courtesy allowed, and in this way he had built, out of absence, a second kind of seeing that served him almost as well as the first, so that even those closest to him sometimes forgot, for whole conversations at a time, that his eyes no longer carried the ordinary burden of light. But prescience, he had always known, was never a possession a man could keep forever without cost, and now that cost arrived, quietly, the way all final costs arrive, not as a thief in the night, but as an old and familiar visitor come at last to collect what had long been owed. He did not rage against it. This, perhaps, was the truest measure of the man that the desert had made him, that when the last light failed, inner and outer both, he received the darkness the way he had once received the terrible burden of the jihad and the crushing weight of every possible future, without complaint, without the smaller cruelties of self-pity that might have comforted a lesser man. In the stillness of that failing light he found himself thinking, not of armies or thrones, but of small and ordinary things, the particular warmth of sand beneath bare feet in the hour before dawn, the taste of spice-laced coffee shared in a sietch long ago, the sound of still-suits hissing softly in the dark as a troop of fedaykin settled in for a night's rest beneath the open sky. These small memories rose in him now with a clarity that the grand and terrible visions of empire had never quite possessed, as though the desert, in taking his sight, had given him back for a moment the plain sweetness of the years before he had become anything more than a boy learning the ways of a hard and beautiful land. He knew what his own people required of the blind. Among the Fremen, an old and unbending law held that one who could no longer see, whose eyes could no longer serve the tribe, whose steps could no longer be trusted upon the rock and the sand, was expected to walk out into the deep desert and give himself to Shai-Hulud, to the great worm and the endless dunes, so that the tribe would not be burdened by what it could not help. It was not exile. It was not punishment. It was, in the old hard reckoning of desert life, a kind of dignity, the last gift a person could offer to those who loved them. And Paul, who had been born of gentler worlds, but remade entirely by the sand, understood this law in his blood as surely as any Fremen born beneath a sietch roof. He had watched, as a young man newly come to Arrakis, the quiet and unremarked departures of the old and the blind from the sietch at dusk, had seen how little ceremony attended them, and how much respect, and he had understood even then, long before he had any reason to think the law might one day apply to himself, that this was not cruelty, but a kind of clean-eyed love, the desert's own way of asking nothing of its people that the desert itself did, not also practice, giving back to the sand everything the sand had ever lent. So it was that he did not summon physicians, and did not call for miracles, and did not send for the Tleilaxu with their tanks and their offers of borrowed flesh, for he had already refused that bargain once, and would not now, in weakness, reach back for it. Instead, he made his preparations quietly, the way a man puts his affairs in order before a long journey, not with panic, but with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who has already seen, in some fold of memory or foresight, that this hour was always coming. There was, in these last hours, a strange and settled peace in him, the peace of a man who has spent so many years carrying the future upon his back that he finds, at the very end, an unexpected lightness in laying that burden down at last, in becoming once more simply a man walking toward a night that would ask nothing further of him than his own 2 feet and his own quiet resolve. He thought, in those last hours of clear awareness, of Chani, gone before him into whatever silence waits beyond the last dune, and of his children not yet fully grown into the weight they would one day carry, and of the empire that would go on, as empires do, indifferent in its vastness to the private grief of the man who had built it. He thought too of his mother, far off on Caladan now, and of the desert itself, patient and unhurried, which had never once asked him to be more than what the sand required, and which now, in this last hour, seemed almost gentle in its waiting. And then, in the hush before dawn, when the palace still slept, and the twin moons had not yet surrendered the sky to the sun, Paul Atreides walked out from the halls of his own making and turned his face toward the open desert. The true desert, not the desert of gardens and canals that men had begun to coax from Arrakis in his name, but the old desert, the deep desert, vast and honest and unconcerned with thrones. The air outside was cool and dry and smelled faintly of cinnamon, the way it always had at that hour, and beneath his bare feet the sand still held a little of the night's chill, though he could feel already, in the fine grain of it, the promise of the heat that would come with the sun. He walked as the blind walk, which is to say slowly, and with his hands sometimes reaching before him. But he walked without hesitation, for this was not a stumbling into darkness, but a deliberate step into a role the desert itself had written for him, long before he ever became an emperor. He carried no guard, no attendants, no retinue of the sort that had followed him since the day 60 billion had died, chanting his name across the stars. He carried only himself, stripped at last of crown and title, walking as Usul once more, a man of the sand returning to the sand. Somewhere far off, beneath the dunes, the great worms stirred in their old slow rhythms, sensing perhaps nothing more than vibration and heat, caring nothing for empires or prophecies, and it was into their keeping that the blind emperor walked, calm, upright, unafraid. The way a man walks toward a door he has already opened in his mind 1,000 times before his feet ever cross the threshold. The dunes rolled away from him in the last dark blue of the night, silent and immense, and somewhere within that silence he seemed, for just a moment, to hear again the low singing of the sietch, the old songs of water and sand that had first taught him what it meant to belong to this place. The desert took him the way the desert has always taken those given to it, without ceremony, without cruelty, simply as one more shape folded into the great and ancient turning of sand upon sand, and so ended, quietly and with a dignity that no jihad and no throne had ever truly diminished, the mortal walking of muad'dib, the man who had once been Paul Atreides, who had loved a woman named Chani beneath these same stars, and who now returned to the desert that had first given him his name. Up next in Chapter 19, Alia, regent of a waiting empire, we will turn to the sister who was never merely a child, and to the strange watchful calm that settled over the Imperium as it waited, holding its breath, to see what would come next. In the hush that follows the departure of any great ruler, an empire does not simply stop, however much its people might wish, in their grief, for the world to pause and match the stillness in their own hearts. The business of governing 10,000 worlds continues. The harvests of spice must still be gathered from the deep desert. The ships of the guild must still cross the vast dark between the stars, and the petitioners still gather at the palace gates with their disputes and their hopes, whether or not the man they called muad'dib walks among them any longer. And so, into this continuing world, into this vast machinery that does not know how to rest, there stepped a regent, and the regent was Alia, sister of Paul, daughter of Duke Leto and the Lady Jessica, and she was, from the very first hour of her life, unlike any child who had ever been asked to rule. Alia had never known an ordinary childhood, not because the desert was hard, though it was, and not because the jihad had swept the world into fire around her cradle, though it had done that too, but because she had never truly known the slow, gentle unfolding of a mind the way other children know it, waking day by day into a world that grows only gradually more understood. She had been aware, in some deep and terrible sense since before her own birth, for the change of the water of life that had transformed her mother into a reverend mother had transformed the unborn child as well, waking in her a consciousness vast beyond her years, filled with the pressed and layered memories of countless women who had come before her, so that Alia opened her eyes upon the world already carrying within her the weight of ages, a small body wrapped around an ancient and crowded awareness. In the quiet hours of the palace at night, when the corridors emptied and the ordinary business of empire fell silent, she sometimes found herself listening to that inner chorus the way another woman might listen to rain against a window, familiar, unceasing, neither wholly comfortable nor wholly unwelcome, simply the sound that had always filled the rooms of her mind since before she had a mind of her own to call entirely hers. The Fremen, in their careful and unsentimental language, had a word for such a person, for one who is born already knowing, and they called her Reverend Mother in truth, though she wore the shape of a child, and this was both her burden and her strange authority. It was this same Alia who now stood at the center of the Imperium's turning, holding the reins that her brother had once held, and she did so not as a placeholder waiting quietly for someone else to arrive, but as a ruler in her own right, sharp-eyed, deliberate, and formidable in ways that unsettled even those who had served Paul, without complaint through all the long years of his reign. She kept, in these early days of her regency, a habit of walking the palace corridors alone in the last hour before sleep, past the tall windows that looked out over the city and, beyond it, the pale reach of the desert under starlight, and in those quiet walks she seemed, to the few guards who ever glimpsed her passing, less like a woman weighing the fate of worlds and more like someone simply listening, patiently, to whatever the night had to tell her. The great houses of the Landsraad, accustomed to bowing before an emperor whose prescience made him nearly impossible to outmaneuver, now found themselves facing a regent whose mind held a different and equally unsettling depth, not the sight of the future exactly, but the compounded cunning of 1,000 lives lived before her own. And they discovered, some to their sorrow, that underestimating her carried its own quiet cost. The mainmise of House Atreides upon the Imperium did not loosen in the absence of Paul. If anything, it tightened, held now in hands that were smaller, but no less certain. Around Alia there grew, in these years, a priesthood devoted to the memory and the mystery of her brother, for Muad'dib had not simply been an emperor, but a figure of religious awe to the peoples who had followed his jihad across the stars, and in his absence that awe did not fade, but deepened, taking the shape that grief and reverence so often take, becoming doctrine, becoming ritual, becoming an entire structure of priests and interpreters who administered the memory of muad'dib the way earlier faiths had administered the memory of gods who once walked visibly among men. Pilgrims came now by the shipload to Arrakis, drawn across the dark between stars by nothing more than the hope of standing, however briefly, upon the same sand their prophet had once walked, and the priesthood that received them grew accordingly vast and intricate, its halls filling with the murmured prayers of travelers who had crossed half the galaxy simply to be near the memory of a man they had never met and never would. Alia stood at the center of this priesthood as well, both regent of the temporal empire and keeper of its spiritual heart, a dual weight that would have bent almost anyone else into some smaller and more brittle shape. She carried it instead with a composure that seemed, to those who watched her closely, almost too perfect, almost too practiced for a woman still young in body, though of course she was not young in any way that mattered beneath the surface. And there were those among the old Bene Gesserit orders who watched her from a careful distance and wondered, in their private councils, what it might cost a mind to hold so many other minds within it for so very long. There were quiet hours, too, that belonged to Alia alone. Hours when the great councils had emptied and the priests had returned to their devotions, and she might stand for a while at some high window, simply watching the light change over the dunes, the gold of afternoon deepening slowly into the long violet of evening, the way it had changed over this same desert every day for longer than any empire had stood upon it. In those hours, if anyone had asked her what she felt, she might have said only that the desert did not care what she carried within her, that the sand did not distinguish between a girl and the 1,000 women pressed inside that girl's memory, and that this indifference was, in its own strange way, a comfort, a reminder that some things in the universe simply continued, regardless of what any single mind, however crowded, made of them. For a time, though, in these early years of her regency, a kind of provisional calm did settle over the great and scattered worlds of the Imperium, the uneasy calm of a household that has just lost its head and has not yet decided how it feels about the one who now sits in the empty chair. The guild continued its silent traffic between the stars. The spice continued to flow from the deep sands of Arrakis into the hands of nobles and mystics and navigators across 1,000 worlds who could not survive without it. The Bene Gesserit continued their long and patient breeding of futures, watching Alia as they watched everything, with an attention that never truly rested. And in the nurseries of the palace, largely unseen by the great councils arguing over trade and tribute, 2 small children grew, the twins born of Paul and Chani, carrying within them, as their aunt had carried within her, far more than their tiny bodies seemed to promise. Alia visited them often in these quiet hours, sitting beside their cradles in the soft lamplight, watching them sleep with an attentiveness that was part duty and part something gentler, something almost like the ordinary tenderness an aunt might feel for the children of a beloved brother. However extraordinary the inheritance those children carried, she wondered, sometimes in the stillness of those nurseries, what it would mean for them to wake one day into full awareness of everything folded inside them, as she herself had never truly had the mercy of a slow waking. And she found in that wondering both an old, tired kinship and a quiet hope that their path might yet prove gentler than her own had been. They were waiting, as all such quiet and watchful children wait, for the day the wider world would finally turn to look at them. Up next in Chapter 20, the children who would inherit the storm, we will turn at last to Leto and Ganima, the twins whose slow, patient growing would, in time, shape the whole long future of the Imperium, and we will let the desert settle, gently, into rest. In the quiet nurseries of the palace, far from the councils where lords and priests argued over the shape of the empire that Muad'dib had left behind, 2 children grew, and though they were small, and though their days passed in the same gentle rhythms that mark the growing of any child, playing, sleeping, learning slowly the textures of the world around them, they were, in truth, unlike any children who had come before them, carrying within their small bodies an inheritance stranger, and older than anything found in the treasuries of the Imperium. These were Leto and Ganima, the twins born of Paul Atreides and Chani, born of the desert and of prophecy both, and like their aunt Alia before them, they had come into the world already awake, already carrying, folded within their young minds, the pressed and layered memory of countless lives that had lived and died before them, so that even in their cradles, they held a kind of ancient patience that no ordinary infant could ever have known. It was a strange gift, and a heavy one, to be born already remembering, to open one's eyes for the first time upon the world, and find that world already familiar in ways too old and too vast to explain to those around you, and yet the twins bore it, as children do, by simply living within it, learning day by day how to hold the weight of so much inherited knowing alongside the small, ordinary business of being young, of watching light move across a wall, of listening to the wind above the qanats, of learning the sound of their own names spoken gently by those who loved them. There was, in the nursery, a particular hour each evening when the nurses would draw back the heavy curtains so that the last light of the desert sun could fall across the floor, and the twins would lie together in that warm gold light, quiet and watchful, as though they recognized in the color of it something older than the room they lay in, something that belonged to the deep memory each of them carried, rather than to the short handful of days they had actually lived. In this, they were not so different from any child anywhere, only more so, their curiosity larger, their patience deeper, their eyes carrying, even in stillness, something of the long desert quiet their father had once carried in his own gaze. They were close in the particular way that twins so often are, though theirs was closer still, bound not only by the ordinary intimacy of siblings who share a cradle and a name, but by something harder to name, a kind of quiet understanding that passed between them without need of words, as though each already sensed, somewhere beneath the surface of ordinary awareness, the crowded and ancient company that lived inside the other. Ganima, the nurses said, had a way of falling still and listening whenever her brother stirred in his sleep, and Leto in turn would often reach for her hand in the dark before either of them had fully woken, the two of them settling back into rest together the moment their fingers touched, as though some old and patient part of each of them recognized in the other a fellow traveler along a road neither yet fully understood. It was a small thing, this reaching for a twin's hand in the dark, and yet it seemed, to those who watched over them, to hold within it some quiet promise of how the two would meet whatever lay ahead of them, together, unhurried, each a steadying presence for the other. The Imperium, for all its vastness, for all the great and unresolved questions that still hung over it in the absence of the Emperor who had once bound it together, could not yet know what these two children would become, and this not knowing was, in its own way, a kind of mercy, allowing the twins the small grace of simply growing, unhurried. Unclaimed for a while longer by the great turning wheel of history that had already claimed so much from their family. In the mornings, before the palace fully woke, they were sometimes carried out onto a shaded terrace to feel the first cool air of the day before the heat rose from the sand, and there they would sit for long stretches, content simply to watch the light change over the dunes, patient in a way that seemed, even to their nurses, almost too old for children so young, as though some quiet, ancient part of them already understood that patience was itself a kind of shelter against everything still to come. Somewhere ahead of them, though neither the court nor the priesthood, nor even the most careful watchers among the Bene Gesserit, could yet see its full shape, there waited a long path that would ask everything of them, a path their father had glimpsed in fragments through his own difficult sight and had never fully walked himself, a path golden and terrible and necessary in ways that would only reveal themselves slowly across years and years yet to come. But that path was not yet theirs to walk, for now there was only the quiet unfolding of childhood, wrapped in memory instead of innocence, but childhood nonetheless. And so, in this hour, with the desert stretching wide and calm beneath the twin moons of Arrakis, it is enough simply to picture them, small and steady, walking hand in hand perhaps through the cool corridors of the palace in the last hours before sleep. their small footsteps soft against the stone, pausing now and then before a tall window to watch the sand stretch out pale and endless beneath the moonlight, unhurried, unafraid, simply looking, the way children look at a world that is still, for them, mostly wonder, or sitting together at some high window, watching the last color drain gently from the sky above the dunes where their father had once walked as a young man newly named Usul, where he had loved a woman named Chani beneath these same slow-turning stars, and where, at the very end, he had walked once more, blind and unafraid, back into the sand that made him. The empire he had built still stood. The jihad had quieted into memory and doctrine. Alia held the regency with a steady, watchful hand, and beneath her care the twins grew, unhurried, toward whatever long future awaited them. Each night folding gently into the next, each small day adding, quietly, to the long patience that would one day carry them forward. The desert itself asked nothing of the world that night, as it asks nothing of any night, patient in the way only deserts are patient, its dunes shifting by degrees too slow for any eye to catch, its silence holding within it, as it always had, both an ending and the quiet promise of everything still to come. The wind moved low across the sand, carrying with it the faint, dry scent of cinnamon that had always marked this world, and somewhere far off a last stirring of warmth rose from the cooling dunes before settling, at last, into the long, cool hush of night. Somewhere beneath that silence the great worms turned in their old, slow rhythms, patient and vast, and untroubled by the small affairs of thrones. And somewhere above it, the stars wheeled on exactly as they always had, indifferent and eternal, marking no hour but their own. In the palace, the lamps were lowered one by one until only a faint glow remained in the corridor outside the nursery, and there, in that soft and steady light, the children slept, and the empire slept a little around them, and the long story of House Atreides settled, for this one gentle hour, into rest. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight we followed the 12 years after Paul won, the throne taken at terrible cost, the jihad unleashed across the stars, the 60 billion dead in his name, and a man made emperor and god against his will. We felt the weight of every possible future pressing on him, the longing of Chani for a child, the princess who was a wife in name only, and the slow gathering of a conspiracy in the shadows. We watched the gift of a Gola arrive, the face dancer and the dwarf, the stone that burned away his sight, and the strange grace of a blind man who could still see. We came to the return to the desert, the birth of the twins, the death of Chani, the Gola who remembered his own name, and a bargain quietly refused. We watched the emperor walk into the sand as the Fremen do, Alia left regent of a waiting empire, and 2 children who would one day inherit the storm. There is nothing left now that you must carry. Let each of those vast and heavy things sink away from you, down through still and silent sand, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here asks anything of you, and none of it can follow you into sleep. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like heat shimmer over an evening dune. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us, and let a gentle subscribe keep them coming. There are many more long, slow tales waiting for the nights ahead.